Welcome, guardian of Gotham's shadows, to a journey through the dark chronicles of the Arkham universe, where the line between hero and monster blurs beneath the pale glow of asylum lights and the echoing screams of Gotham's most dangerous minds. Tonight, we shall traverse the complete mythology of Batman's darkest trials, from his earliest encounters with madness to his final sacrifice in the flames of Wayne Manor. Let the rhythm of rain against asylum windows and the whisper of cape against stone carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore every shadow, every secret, every tragic transformation that shaped the legend of the Dark Knight in his most challenging incarnation. In the beginning, before the symbol of the bat cast its protective shadow across the twisted spires and smoke-darkened streets of Gotham City, there existed a child whose world was shattered in an instant of gunfire and blood, whose innocence died in the space between heartbeats while standing in an alley that would forever after be known as Crime Alley. This child was Bruce Wayne, heir to a fortune built upon generations of philanthropy and civic duty, yet destined to inherit something far more precious and far more terrible than mere wealth: the burden of witnessing evil in its purest form and choosing to stand against it regardless of the personal cost. The transformation from grieving orphan to guardian of justice was neither swift nor simple, for it required not merely the accumulation of skills and resources, but the fundamental restructuring of a human soul around principles that most would find impossible to maintain under the weight of constant moral challenge. Young Bruce Wayne's journey into the shadows began not with the donning of a cape and cowl, but with a pilgrimage to distant lands where ancient traditions preserved knowledge that modern civilization had forgotten or dismissed as primitive superstition. In the mountains of Korea, hidden within mists that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time, stood a castle whose stones had been placed by hands that understood the true relationship between discipline and power, between suffering and strength. Here, beneath the tutelage of the master known as Kirigi, Bruce Wayne learned lessons that could not be found in any university or acquired through any amount of wealth, for they dealt with the deepest mysteries of human potential and the price that must be paid to unlock capabilities that transcended normal limitations. The way of the Shadow Warrior, as Kirigi taught it, was not merely a collection of combat techniques or methods of concealment, but rather a comprehensive philosophy of existence that viewed the entire world as a battlefield, where the forces of order and chaos waged eternal war for the souls of conscious beings. To master this way required more than physical conditioning or intellectual study. It demanded a willingness to confront the darkness within oneself and emerge from that confrontation transformed yet still fundamentally human. The training that Bruce endured in those mountain halls pushed his body beyond what medicine would have deemed possible. Yet the physical challenges were merely the foundation for more profound transformations that occurred at levels that conventional understanding could not adequately describe. Hours spent in meditation revealed to him the interconnected nature of fear and courage, showing how one could not exist without the other, and how mastery lay not in the elimination of fear but in the conscious choice to act in spite of it. The combat techniques that Kirigi shared with his student were ancient beyond memory, refined through countless generations of practitioners who had devoted their lives to the pursuit of perfect balance between strength and restraint, between the capacity to destroy and the wisdom to preserve. These were not mere fighting styles, but expressions of deeper truths about the nature of conflict itself, methods of resolving disputes through the application of precisely measured force that sought to end violence rather than perpetuate it. Yet perhaps the most valuable lesson that Bruce learned during his time in the Shadow Castle was the understanding that true power came not from the ability to defeat enemies through superior technique, but from the capacity to inspire others to choose hope over despair, courage over cowardice, sacrifice over selfishness. The greatest warriors in history had not been those who accumulated the most victories in battle, but those who had found ways to prevent battles from becoming necessary in the first place. The final test of his training came in the form of combat against Lady Shiva, Kirigi's most accomplished student, and a fighter whose skills had become legendary among those who understood such matters. The battle between Bruce Wayne and Shiva was not merely a contest of technique, but a philosophical debate conducted through the medium of physical confrontation. Each strike and parry expressing different approaches to the fundamental questions of how power should be exercised and what responsibilities accompanied superior capability. When Bruce finally emerged victorious from this encounter, it was not because he had proven himself stronger or faster than his opponent, but because he had demonstrated something far more rare and valuable: the ability to maintain moral clarity in the midst of life and death struggle, to remember what he was fighting for, even when survival itself hung in the balance. This quality, more than any specific technique or tactical knowledge, marked him as worthy of the secrets that Kirigi had spent a lifetime collecting and refining. The return to Gotham City after his years of training brought Bruce face to face with challenges that no amount of preparation could have fully anticipated, for the corruption that had taken root in his absence had grown like a cancer, spreading through every institution and every level of society, until it seemed impossible that any force, however determined, could successfully oppose it. The city that he remembered from his childhood had been replaced by something darker and more dangerous, a place where hope itself had become a casualty of systemic failure and willful blindness. The Wayne Industries that Bruce inherited was more than a business empire. It was a symbol of what Gotham had once been, and might someday become again. A testament to the possibility that wealth and power could be used in service of the greater good, rather than merely for personal advancement. Yet even this legacy had not been immune to the forces of decay that had consumed so much of the city, requiring careful restoration and constant vigilance to maintain its role as a force for positive change. Alfred Pennyworth, the loyal butler who had served the Wayne family for decades, became far more than a domestic servant during Bruce's transformation into something beyond conventional heroism. His role evolved into that of moral compass, tactical advisor, and surrogate father to a young man who had chosen to shoulder responsibilities that would have crushed anyone of lesser determination or weaker character. Alfred's wisdom, born from years of observing the best and worst of human nature, provided the grounding that prevented Bruce's mission from degenerating into mere vigilantism or personal revenge. The creation of the Batcave beneath Wayne Manor represented more than the establishment of a headquarters for crime-fighting activities. It symbolized the conscious choice to descend into darkness in order to better understand and combat it. The cave system, with its natural acoustics and hidden passages, its underground rivers and towering stone formations, became a physical manifestation of Bruce Wayne's psychological landscape, a place where the boundary between civilization and primal nature was deliberately blurred. The technology that filled the Batcave was not merely an assemblage of advanced equipment, but a carefully integrated system designed to amplify human capabilities while maintaining the essential humanity of its user. Every device, from the massive Bat computer to the smallest surveillance gadget, was created according to principles that prioritized effectiveness over efficiency, moral clarity over pragmatic compromise. The goal was not to replace human judgment with technological solutions, but to provide the tools necessary for one human being to operate effectively on a scale normally reserved for entire organizations. The early investigations that Bruce undertook as Batman revealed the true scope of the corruption that had infected Gotham's institutions, demonstrating how criminal enterprises and supposedly legitimate businesses had become so intertwined that separating them would require surgical precision and unwavering dedication to principles that most people would find impossibly idealistic. The networks of influence and intimidation that protected figures like Roman Siones and Oswald Cobblepot extended into every corner of city government, creating situations where conventional law enforcement was either powerless or actively complicit. The psychological warfare that Batman employed against these criminal networks was based upon understanding gained through his training with Kirigi, knowledge of how fear could be used as a tool for justice rather than oppression. The symbol of the bat, carefully chosen for its associations with mystery and nocturnal predation, became a weapon more powerful than any physical force, striking terror into the hearts of those who preyed upon the innocent, while inspiring hope in those who had believed themselves forgotten by justice. Commissioner Gillian Loeb represented everything that was wrong with Gotham's approach to law enforcement, embodying the kind of institutional corruption that made vigilante action seem not merely justified but necessary. His willingness to allow criminal enterprises to operate freely in exchange for personal benefit demonstrated how the very systems designed to protect society could become instruments of its destruction when they were controlled by individuals who had abandoned their fundamental responsibilities. The network of corrupt officers that supported Loeb's regime included figures like Lieutenant Howard Brandon and Detective Arnold Flass, men who had entered law enforcement with noble intentions, but had gradually been worn down by the seemingly hopeless nature of their task until they chose collaboration over resistance. Their transformation from protectors to predators illustrated the seductive power of cynicism and the importance of maintaining moral standards, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The early alliance between Batman and the mysterious hacker who would later be revealed as Edward Nygma demonstrated the potential for cooperation between individuals who shared common goals despite vast differences in methodology and common motivation. The Riddler's intellectual approach to crime fighting complemented Batman's more direct methods, providing crucial intelligence that made it possible to unravel conspiracies that had seemed impenetrable to conventional investigation. The relationship between Roman Sionis and Oswald Cobblepot revealed how criminal enterprises could maintain the appearance of rivalry while actually cooperating to achieve mutual objectives, using public conflict as a distraction from their shared goal of subverting democratic institutions and replacing them with systems that served their own interests. Their manipulation of mayoral elections demonstrated the vulnerability of democratic processes to individuals who possessed sufficient resources and lacked moral constraints. The rescue operation at the Beacon Hotel marked Batman's first major intervention in a criminal conspiracy of significant scope, testing both his tactical abilities and his commitment to protecting innocent life, even when such protection required accepting that some criminals might escape justice. The decision to prioritize saving Harvey Dent's sister over capturing the masterminds behind her kidnapping established a pattern that would define Batman's entire approach to crime fighting. The preservation of innocent life always took precedence over the punishment of the guilty. The moral complexity of these early cases forced Bruce Wayne to confront questions about the nature of justice and the proper relationship between law and order that would continue to shape his worldview throughout his career as Batman. The recognition that existing institutions were inadequate to address the challenges facing Gotham did not lead him to abandon hope for their eventual reform, but rather inspired him to work toward creating conditions where such reform might become possible. The Christmas Eve confrontation at Blackgate Prison that would forever change both Bruce Wayne's understanding of his mission and Gotham City's relationship with its self-appointed protector began with what seemed like a routine criminal enterprise, but quickly escalated into something far more significant and dangerous. Black Mask's decision to break Calendar Man out of his death row cell represented more than a simple prison break. It symbolized the complete breakdown of the barriers between different categories of criminals and the beginning of a new phase in Gotham's descent into chaos. The $50 million bounty that Black Mask placed on Batman's head represented a fundamental shift in the nature of criminal activity in Gotham City, transforming what had been local disputes into matters of international significance and attracting the attention of killers whose reputations extended far beyond the borders of any single city or nation. The 8 assassins who accepted this contract each brought their own unique skills and philosophies to bear on the problem of eliminating the Dark Knight, creating challenges that would test every aspect of his training and preparation. Captain James Gordon's first direct encounter with Batman established the foundation for what would become one of the most important partnerships in the history of law enforcement, though neither man could have predicted at the time how profound and lasting their connection would become. Gordon's initial skepticism about the masked vigilante's methods was balanced by his recognition that conventional approaches had failed to address the scale of corruption and violence that threatened to consume his city. The philosophical framework that guided Bruce Wayne's transformation into Batman was rooted in principles that transcended simple crime prevention or law enforcement, encompassing instead a comprehensive vision of what human society could become if individuals were willing to sacrifice their own comfort and safety in service of higher ideals. His choice to become a symbol rather than merely another player in Gotham's criminal justice system reflected a deep understanding that lasting change required inspiration rather than intimidation, hope rather than fear. The psychological burden that accompanied this choice was enormous, requiring Bruce to maintain his sense of humanity and moral purpose while regularly engaging in activities that would have destroyed the mental health of anyone less prepared or less committed to their fundamental mission. The isolation that inevitably resulted from living a double life was offset only by his relationships with allies who shared his dedication to justice, individuals like Alfred Pennyworth, who provided the emotional support necessary to prevent his crusade from consuming him entirely. The early victories that Batman achieved against Gotham's criminal establishment, though significant in their immediate impact, represented only the beginning of a much larger and more complex struggle that would eventually encompass threats ranging from local organized crime to cosmic entities whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The foundation laid during these formative encounters would prove essential to weathering the storms that lay ahead, providing the moral and tactical framework necessary to confront enemies whose power and malevolence exceeded anything that conventional preparation could have anticipated. On the most sacred night of the Christian calendar, when families throughout Gotham City gathered in warmth and celebration to commemorate the birth of hope into a world shrouded in darkness, the forces of evil chose to launch their most audacious assault against the fragile peace that the Batman had begun to establish through months of careful investigation and strategic intervention. Christmas Eve in Gotham had always carried particular significance for Bruce Wayne, marking as it did the anniversary of countless childhood memories made precious by their scarcity. Yet this particular Christmas Eve would transform from a night of reflection into a crucible that would test every aspect of his preparation and commitment to his chosen mission. The intelligence that reached Batman's ears through the sophisticated network of informants and electronic surveillance that he had painstakingly constructed throughout the city carried news that chilled his blood more thoroughly than the winter wind that howled through the skeletal branches of Gotham's leafless trees. Roman Sionis, the crime lord whose machinations had already claimed the lives of countless innocents and whose corruption had infected the highest levels of city government, had apparently decided that Commissioner Loeb's usefulness had reached its end and that his elimination would serve both practical and symbolic purposes in the ongoing war for control of Gotham's soul. The location chosen for this dramatic confrontation was Blackgate Penitentiary, the fortress-like structure that rose from the dark waters surrounding Gotham, like a monument to society's failure to address the root causes of criminal behavior. Within its walls were housed the worst specimens of humanity that the city had produced. Individuals whose crimes had been so heinous or whose psychological profiles had been so disturbing that even Gotham's notoriously lenient criminal justice system had been forced to acknowledge the necessity of permanent incarceration. Batman's arrival at Blackgate revealed a scene of carefully orchestrated chaos that spoke to Roman Sionis's tactical brilliance and his complete disregard for human life in pursuit of his strategic objectives. The prison break that was already in progress when the Dark Knight reached the facility had been designed not merely to secure the freedom of specific criminals, but to create maximum disruption and terror, demonstrating to both law enforcement and rival criminal organizations that Black Mask's reach extended into even the most secure locations in the city. Among the prisoners whose liberation had been engineered by Sionis's operatives was the massive figure of Waylon Jones, known throughout Gotham's underworld by the appropriately descriptive moniker Killer Croc. Jones represented one of nature's most disturbing aberrations, a human being whose genetic structure had been so profoundly altered by unknown factors that his appearance and behavior more closely resembled those of a prehistoric predator than a member of modern civilization. His strength was legendary among those who had witnessed it, his savagery untempered by any trace of the moral reasoning that separated humanity from the animal kingdom. The partnership between Black Mask and Killer Croc was one of mutual convenience rather than genuine alliance, for neither possessed the capacity for loyalty or friendship that might have created lasting bonds between them. Sionis valued Jones purely for his ability to inflict terror and destruction upon his enemies, while Croc's simple mind was easily manipulated by promises of violence and the opportunity to satisfy his primitive hunger for combat and dominance. Their collaboration represented everything that was wrong with Gotham's criminal ecosystem, demonstrating how sophisticated intelligence could exploit and direct raw brutality toward purposes that served neither participant's long-term interests. The specific prisoner whose freedom had been purchased through this elaborate operation was Calendar Man, a killer whose obsession with dates and temporal significance had led him to commit murders timed according to various holiday and anniversary schedules. His crimes were characterized by meticulous planning and symbolic complexity that spoke to a diseased mind capable of intricate reasoning, yet completely divorced from normal human empathy. The decision to rescue him from his scheduled execution suggested that his particular form of madness served some purpose in Black Mask's larger schemes, though the exact nature of that purpose remained hidden beneath layers of misdirection and careful preparation. The execution chamber from which Calendar Man was extracted had been the site of numerous official killings over the decades of Blackgate's operation, a place where society's ultimate judgment had been carried out against those whose crimes had been deemed so severe that rehabilitation was considered impossible. The irony of using this location for Commissioner Loeb's murder was not lost on those who understood the symbolic language that criminals often employed to communicate their intentions and demonstrate their power over the institutions that supposedly controlled them. Black Mask's declaration that he intended to create a clean slate for himself through Loeb's elimination revealed the psychological motivations that drove his criminal empire, the desire not merely for wealth or power, but for the kind of respect and fear that could only be achieved through demonstrations of absolute ruthlessness. His willingness to kill a high-ranking law enforcement official in such a public and dramatic fashion represented an escalation in the ongoing war between Gotham's criminal elements and the forces of justice that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. The $50 million bounty that Black Mask placed upon Batman's head transformed what might have been a local matter into an international incident, attracting the attention of professional killers from around the world who saw the Dark Knight's elimination as both a lucrative opportunity and a chance to enhance their own reputations through association with such a high-profile contract. The sum involved was large enough to tempt even those assassins who normally avoided working in territories controlled by local criminal organizations, ensuring that Batman would face opponents whose skills and resources far exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The 8 assassins who accepted this deadly commission represented a cross-section of the world's most dangerous individuals, each bringing unique capabilities and methodologies to bear upon the problem of eliminating Gotham's self-appointed protector. Their diversity was both a strength and a potential weakness, for while their varied approaches made it difficult for Batman to prepare comprehensive defenses, their lack of coordination and mutual trust created opportunities for exploitation by a sufficiently clever and determined opponent. Killer Croc's inclusion in this group was almost inevitable given his existing relationship with Black Mask and his reputation for savage effectiveness in close combat situations. His approach to assassination was as straightforward as his personality, relying upon overwhelming physical force and primal ferocity to overcome whatever defenses his targets might possess. The challenge he presented was not tactical complexity, but rather the raw test of whether Batman's training and equipment could prevail against an opponent whose strength and durability exceeded normal human limitations by such enormous margins. Deathstroke represented an entirely different category of threat, being a professional soldier whose skills had been honed through years of military service and enhanced through scientific processes that elevated his physical capabilities to superhuman levels. His tactical knowledge was comprehensive, his weapons training extensive, and his experience in lethal combat situations unmatched by anyone, except perhaps Batman himself. The confrontation between these two masters of warfare would test not only their respective abilities, but also their fundamental philosophies regarding the proper application of violence in pursuit of justice. The pyromaniac known as Firefly brought to the hunt a form of madness that expressed itself through obsessive fascination with fire and explosive destruction, making him particularly dangerous in an urban environment where his weapons could cause massive collateral damage among innocent civilians. His psychological profile suggested a mind that had been fractured by traumatic experiences and rebuilt around a single driving compulsion that eliminated normal considerations of self-preservation or concern for others. Fighting such an opponent required not only tactical skill, but also the ability to predict and counter actions that defied conventional logic. Copperhead's inclusion among the assassins introduced an element of exotic lethality that few opponents could match, for her mastery of various poisons and venoms provided her with the ability to kill through methods that were virtually undetectable until their effects had progressed beyond any possibility of reversal. Her flexibility and stealth capabilities made her ideally suited for infiltration and surprise attacks, while her knowledge of biochemistry allowed her to customize her weapons according to the specific vulnerabilities of her intended targets. The marksman called Deadshot epitomized the modern professional assassin, combining advanced technology with supernatural accuracy to eliminate targets from distances that made retaliation virtually impossible. His reputation for never missing a shot was more than mere boasting, representing instead a mathematical certainty that had been proven through countless successful contracts over a career spanning multiple continents and criminal organizations. The The challenge he presented was primarily one of detection and approach. For once he had established a clear line of sight to his target, the outcome was rarely in doubt. Electrocutioner's reliance upon electrical weapons and enhanced physical capabilities made him a formidable opponent in close combat situations, though his lack of subtlety and tactical sophistication rendered him more of a blunt instrument than a precision tool. His effectiveness depended largely upon the element of surprise and his ability to quickly overwhelm opponents before they could adapt to his unusual fighting style. Against a prepared and experienced adversary like Batman, his chances of success were significantly reduced, though he remained dangerous enough to pose a serious threat if underestimated. The chemically enhanced super soldier known as Bane represented perhaps the most complex and dangerous of all the assassins who had accepted Black Mask's contract, for his combination of intellectual brilliance and physical supremacy created challenges that could not be addressed through conventional tactical responses. His use of the performance-enhancing drug called Venom allowed him to achieve levels of strength and endurance that rivaled those of mythological heroes, while his strategic mind remained capable of sophisticated planning and tactical adaptation, even while under the influence of his chemical enhancers. Lady Shiva's presence among the assembled killers carried particular significance for Bruce Wayne, representing as she did a direct connection to his training under Master Kirigi and a test of whether the lessons learned in those distant mountains could be successfully applied under the life and death pressures of actual combat. Her skills as a martial artist were legendary throughout the international community of warriors and assassins. Her reputation built upon victories over opponents whose own capabilities had seemed unassailable until they faced her in battle. The psychological warfare that accompanied these physical threats was as dangerous as any weapon that the assassins carried, for the knowledge that 8 of the world's most skilled killers were simultaneously hunting him created pressures that could easily overwhelm even the most disciplined mind. The temptation to remain hidden within the security of the Batcave was enormous. Yet Batman understood that such a response would represent a fundamental betrayal of his mission and an abandonment of the innocent people who depended upon his protection. The investigation that led Batman to the Penguin's floating hideout aboard the derelict ship called the Final Offer demonstrated his commitment to proactive rather than reactive approaches to the dangers that surrounded him, though the intelligence he gathered came at the cost of direct confrontation with Deathstroke, in an environment that favored the assassin's preferred fighting style. The battle between these two masters of combat was as much philosophical debate as physical contest, each seeking to prove the superiority of their chosen approach to the application of violence in pursuit of their respective goals. The revelation that murders had occurred at Lacey Tower, one of Black Mask's supposedly secure safe houses, introduced an element of mystery that elevated the night's events beyond simple assassination attempts into something approaching a complex puzzle that would require all of Batman's detective skills to solve. The crime scene analysis that followed demonstrated both the sophistication of the perpetrator's methods and the depth of planning that had gone into creating a narrative that would misdirect investigators while advancing hidden agendas. The discovery that the supposed victim was not actually Roman Sionis, but rather an elaborate deception designed to conceal the true sequence of events, forced Batman to reconsider his assumptions about the nature of the threats facing him and the identity of those responsible for orchestrating the night's chaos. The introduction of the figure known only as the Joker represented a paradigm shift in Gotham's criminal landscape, bringing to the city's underworld a form of madness that operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding or prediction. The Joker's methods, as revealed through careful analysis of the available evidence, demonstrated a mind that was simultaneously brilliant and completely unhinged. capable of intricate planning and flawless execution, yet driven by motivations that seem to serve no rational purpose beyond the creation of chaos and the destruction of established order. His apparent obsession with Batman suggested that their confrontation had been inevitable from the moment the Dark Knight had begun his war against Gotham's criminal elements, though the specific form that obsession would take remained hidden beneath layers of misdirection and theatrical presentation. The infiltration of GCPD headquarters that Batman undertook in order to access the criminal database represented one of his most daring operations to date, requiring him to overcome not only sophisticated security systems, but also the personal trust that figures like Barbara Gordon and Commissioner James Gordon had begun to place in his mission. The moral complexity of deceiving allies in pursuit of information necessary to protect innocent lives highlighted the ethical compromises that were inherent in vigilante activities, no matter how noble their ultimate purposes might be. Barbara Gordon's assistance in establishing remote access to the police database marked the beginning of what would become one of the most important partnerships in Batman's career, though neither participant could have predicted at the time how significant their relationship would become or how many challenges they would face together in the years ahead. Her technical skills and insider knowledge complemented Batman's investigative abilities perfectly, while her moral clarity and unwavering commitment to justice provided guidance that helped prevent his mission from degenerating into mere revenge-seeking. The confrontation with Commissioner Gordon in the corridors of GCPD headquarters tested Batman's ability to maintain his mission's integrity while operating within the constraints imposed by Gotham's legitimate law enforcement establishment. Gordon's skepticism about vigilante methods was entirely reasonable given his responsibility for public safety and his oath to uphold constitutional principles. Yet his willingness to listen to Batman's arguments suggested a pragmatic recognition that extraordinary circumstances might require extraordinary responses. The underground pursuit that led Batman through Gotham's sewer system to the data center where he could establish his computer connection demonstrated both his commitment to thorough investigation and his willingness to operate in environments where conventional law enforcement would be severely disadvantaged. The battle with Black Mask's operatives in these subterranean tunnels showcased tactical skills that had been honed through years of training, while also revealing the physical and mental demands that his chosen mission placed upon him on a nightly basis. The revelation that the Joker had been manipulating events from behind the scenes, using the Black Mask identity as a cover for his own activities, while simultaneously eliminating his competitors and establishing his dominance over Gotham's criminal underworld, demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that elevated him far above the common criminals who had previously challenged Batman's authority. His ability to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously, while advancing complex long-term objectives, suggested that future confrontations would require entirely new approaches and unprecedented levels of preparation. The bank robbery that served as the Joker's formal introduction to Gotham's underworld was designed not merely to acquire funds for his operations, but to establish his reputation as someone who operated according to rules that differed fundamentally from those governing normal criminal enterprises. His willingness to kill innocent civilians for no apparent reason, beyond the demonstration of his power, created a new category of threat that Batman would need to learn to counter, one that could not be addressed through conventional crime-fighting techniques. The death of the bank manager through exposure to some form of chemical agent that produced the characteristic rictus grin associated with the Joker's calling card represented the first manifestation of what would become his signature method of murder. The psychological impact of witnessing such a death extended far beyond the immediate victim to encompass everyone who encountered the corpse, creating ripple effects of fear and revulsion that served the Joker's purposes more effectively than any amount of conventional intimidation. The rescue of Roman Sionis from the steel mill where the Joker had been holding him captive revealed both the complexity of the madman's schemes and his apparent immunity to the normal motivations that drove other criminals toward cooperation or negotiation. The elaborate trap that had been prepared for Batman's inevitable arrival demonstrated careful study of his methods and capabilities, suggesting that their confrontation had been planned in detail long before their first direct meeting. The poisoning incident involving Copperhead introduced Batman to the reality that his enemies would not hesitate to use methods that could cause permanent damage or death, forcing him to confront the possibility that his commitment to preserving life might not be reciprocated by those he opposed. The hallucinogenic effects of the venom provided him with unwelcome insights into the fragility of his own perceptions and the danger of assuming that his enhanced training would protect him against all forms of attack. The antidote synthesis that Alfred accomplished using the resources of the Batcave's medical facility demonstrated the importance of having comprehensive support systems in place before undertaking missions that involved such extreme risks. The butler's medical knowledge and chemical expertise proved as valuable as any weapon in Batman's arsenal, while his emotional support provided the psychological anchor that prevented fear and uncertainty from overwhelming rational thought processes. The Royal Hotel meeting between the Joker and the remaining assassins marked the transformation of what had begun as a straightforward bounty hunting exercise into something far more complex and dangerous. The execution of Electrocutioner for his failure to complete his assigned task demonstrated that the Joker's methods of maintaining discipline among his subordinates differed dramatically from those employed by more conventional criminal leaders, being based upon theatrical cruelty rather than simple economic incentives. The battle with Bane that followed represented Batman's first encounter with an opponent whose physical capabilities exceeded his own by such significant margins that victory could not be achieved through conventional combat. Technique, the super soldier serum that enhanced Bane's strength to superhuman levels, also affected his psychological state, creating a combatant who was simultaneously more dangerous and more unpredictable than his normal personality might suggest. The intervention of GCPD forces during the climactic confrontation between Batman and Bane demonstrated the complex relationships that existed between different law enforcement approaches and the challenges inherent in coordinating responses to threats that exceeded normal criminal activity. Alfred's decision to call for police assistance reflected his understanding that protecting Bruce Wayne's life took precedence over maintaining the secrecy that surrounded Batman's operations, though the long-term consequences of this exposure remained to be determined. The Joker's apparent death during the rooftop battle, and Batman's instinctive decision to save his falling enemy, established the moral framework that would govern all their future encounters, demonstrating that the Dark Knight's commitment to preserving life extended even to those who had proven themselves willing to take innocent lives without remorse. This choice, viewed by many as evidence of weakness or misguided idealism, actually represented the core principle that separated heroism from vigilantism and justice from revenge. The psychological analysis session between Dr. Harleen Quinzel and the captured Joker provided insights into the madman's origins and mental state that would prove crucial to understanding his future actions and motivations. The revelation that his transformation had been triggered by a chemical accident during a failed robbery attempt suggested that his current condition might be as much a result of circumstances as conscious choice, though this possibility did little to diminish the threat he represented to innocent lives. The origin story of the Red Hood persona that the Joker had adopted during his criminal career before his transformation demonstrated the tragic irony that often characterized the creation of Gotham's most dangerous criminals. The man who would become the Joker had originally sought only to provide for his family through criminal activity, yet his desperation and poor judgment had led him into situations that ultimately destroyed everything he had hoped to protect. The chemical bath that had transformed the failed comedian into the clown prince of crime served as a perfect metaphor for the way that single moments of crisis could fundamentally alter the trajectory of individual lives, creating monsters from ordinary people who had simply made the wrong choices at crucial turning points. The physical changes that resulted from his exposure to the industrial chemicals were minor compared to the psychological transformation that accompanied them, turning disappointment and despair into homicidal mania. Dr. Quinzel's own transformation during her sessions with the Joker demonstrated the seductive power of madness and the danger that existed for anyone who attempted to understand or treat individuals whose psychological disorders operated according to fundamentally different principles from normal human behavior. Her gradual evolution from concerned physician to devoted accomplice illustrated how exposure to certain forms of mental illness could be contagious for those who lacked adequate psychological defenses. The final confrontation at Blackgate Prison brought together all the narrative threads that had been developing throughout the night, creating a climactic test of Batman's principles and capabilities that would determine not only his immediate survival, but also the future direction of his war against crime. The elaborate death trap that the Joker had prepared, involving both Bane and Commissioner Gordon in a scenario designed to force Batman to choose between his moral code and the lives of innocent people, represented the kind of sophisticated psychological warfare that would become the Madman's signature approach to their ongoing conflict. Batman's solution to the Joker's seemingly impossible challenge demonstrated the creative thinking and moral flexibility that separated true heroism from rigid adherence to abstract principles, showing how genuine commitment to preserving life could find ways to transcend the artificial limitations imposed by those who sought to force tragic choices upon others. The use of electrocution as abandoned gauntlets to stop Bane's heart temporarily while disabling the electric chair mechanism required both tactical innovation and perfect timing, illustrating the importance of being able to adapt established techniques to unexpected circumstances. The aftermath of this confrontation, with the Joker's escape and Bane's memory loss due to the experimental chemical he had injected, established patterns that would define Batman's relationship with both adversaries for years to come. The recognition that some enemies could not be permanently defeated, but only temporarily contained, forced Batman to accept that his mission would require ongoing vigilance and continuous adaptation to new threats and evolving challenges. Commissioner Gordon's gradual acceptance of Batman as a necessary ally in the fight against crime represented one of the most significant victories of the entire night, for it established the foundation for cooperation between vigilante justice and legitimate law enforcement that would prove essential to protecting Gotham from future threats. Their partnership, built upon mutual respect, despite philosophical differences about proper methods and legal constraints, would become one of the most effective crime-fighting alliances in the city's history. In the depths of winter's embrace, when Gotham City lay shrouded beneath blankets of pristine snow that transformed its harsh urban landscape into something approaching beauty, there stirred within the shadows of scientific ambition a tragedy so profound that it would forever alter the very definition of what love could drive a brilliant mind to attempt. This was not merely another tale of criminal enterprise or vigilante justice, but rather a story that spoke to the deepest mysteries of human devotion and the terrible prices that must sometimes be paid when genius encounters the immutable laws of biology and mortality. The man who would become known throughout Gotham as Mr. Freeze had not always been a creature of ice and isolation, condemned to exist within the confines of a cryogenic suit that preserved his life while separating him from all normal human contact. Dr. Victor Freeze had once been among the most promising researchers of his generation, a scientist whose work in the field of cryogenics promised to revolutionize medicine and extend human life in ways that previous generations had only dreamed possible. His laboratory at GothCorp represented the cutting edge of technological innovation, a place where theoretical impossibilities were transformed into practical realities through the application of methodical research and unlimited dedication to the advancement of human knowledge. Yet, beneath the surface of professional achievement and scientific recognition lay a love story so pure and desperate that it transcended the boundaries of conventional romance to become something approaching religious devotion. Nora Fries, the woman who had captured Victor's heart during their university years together, possessed not only the beauty and intelligence that had initially attracted him, but also a rare genetic condition known as Huntington's chorea, a degenerative neurological disorder that would inevitably claim her life unless some unprecedented medical intervention could be developed to halt its relentless progression. The disease that threatened to steal Nora from Victor was particularly cruel in its methodology, attacking the nervous system in ways that gradually stripped away everything that made her the vibrant, brilliant woman he had fallen in love with, while leaving her physical form intact as a mockery of what she had once been. The symptoms began subtly, with minor coordination difficulties and occasional memory lapses that could easily be attributed to stress or fatigue. But medical analysis revealed the terrible truth that her condition would only worsen with time until her mind and body were completely consumed by the genetic flaw that had lain dormant within her cells since birth. The decision to place Nora in cryogenic suspension while Victor worked to develop a cure represented the kind of desperate gamble that only love could justify. For the technology required to preserve human life at sub-zero temperatures while maintaining the cellular integrity necessary for eventual revival was still largely theoretical and had never been successfully tested on human subjects. The process required not merely freezing the body, but rather inducing a state of suspended animation that would halt all biological processes without causing the cellular damage that typically resulted from ice crystal formation within living tissue. The scientific challenges involved in this undertaking were staggering in their complexity, requiring advances in multiple fields of research that would normally take decades to achieve through conventional academic processes. Victor's background in cryogenics provided him with the theoretical foundation necessary to understand the problems he faced. But translating that knowledge into practical solutions required resources and equipment that far exceeded what any individual researcher could hope to acquire through legitimate channels. The partnership that Victor formed with Ferris Boyle, the chief executive officer of GothCorp, appeared initially to offer the perfect solution to his resource limitations, while also providing the corporation with access to cryogenic technologies that could revolutionize industries ranging from medicine to food preservation. Boyle's reputation as a humanitarian businessman who genuinely cared about using corporate resources to benefit humanity seemed to guarantee that Nora's treatment would receive the support and protection necessary for success, while Victor's groundbreaking research would advance human knowledge in ways that could save countless lives beyond his beloved wife. The contract that Victor signed with GothCorp specified that his cryogenic research would be shared with the corporation in exchange for unlimited funding and access to state-of-the-art laboratory facilities, with the understanding that any breakthroughs achieved through this collaboration would be used primarily for humanitarian purposes rather than military applications. The terms seemed generous almost to the point of being unrealistic, yet Victor's desperation to save Nora prevented him from examining too closely the motivations that might drive a profit-oriented corporation to make such apparently altruistic commitments. The laboratory that GothCorp provided for Victor's research was indeed everything that had been promised, equipped with experimental technologies that represented the absolute cutting edge of scientific capability, and staffed with technicians whose expertise complemented his own specialized knowledge perfectly. The work proceeded at a pace that exceeded even Victor's most optimistic projections, with breakthrough following breakthrough in rapid succession as theoretical problems that had seemed intractable yielded to innovative solutions developed through the combination of brilliant insight and unlimited resources. The cryogenic chamber that was constructed to house Nora during her period of suspended animation represented the culmination of months of intensive research and development, incorporating safeguards and monitoring systems that would ensure her preservation, even if the primary life support systems experienced temporary failures. Every component had been tested and retested to ensure perfect reliability, while backup systems provided multiple layers of protection against any conceivable form of technical malfunction or power interruption. Yet, even as Victor celebrated the successful completion of Nora's cryogenic preservation, disturbing signs began to emerge, suggesting that Ferris Boyle's interest in the research extended far beyond the humanitarian applications that had been specified in their original agreement. Corporate executives who had never shown previous interest in scientific matters began visiting the laboratory with increasing frequency, asking detailed questions about the military potential of cryogenic weapons and the possibility of using low-temperature technology as a tool for crowd control or area denial in combat situations. The weapons development program that GothCorp had apparently been planning from the beginning of their collaboration with Victor represented a fundamental betrayal of everything that he had believed about the corporation's mission and values. The prototype devices that corporate engineers began constructing using his research were designed not to preserve life but to destroy it, turning the same principles that kept Nora alive into instruments of death and destruction that could freeze human beings solid within seconds of exposure. Victor's horror at discovering this perversion of his work was compounded by his growing realization that his own position within the corporation had become increasingly precarious as his usefulness to their military projects approached completion. The scientists and technicians who had worked alongside him began disappearing from the laboratory, reassigned to other projects, or terminated entirely as GothCorp moved to eliminate potential witnesses to the true nature of their cryogenic weapons program. The confrontation that inevitably occurred when Victor attempted to withdraw from the project and retrieve Nora from GothCorp's custody demonstrated the extent to which corporate interests had diverged from the humanitarian goals that had originally justified their partnership. Ferris Boyle's revelation that he had never intended to honor his commitments regarding peaceful applications of the research transformed what had seemed like a mutually beneficial collaboration into something approaching industrial, espionage and corporate kidnapping. The decision to relocate Nora's cryogenic chamber to a secure facility beyond Victor's reach was presented as a necessary security measure to protect valuable corporate assets, but its true purpose was obviously to maintain leverage over a scientist whose knowledge and expertise had become too dangerous to allow him complete independence. The implicit threat to Nora's safety that accompanied this relocation provided Boyle with what he believed would be sufficient control over Victor's future actions and decisions. The laboratory accident that transformed Victor Freeze from brilliant scientist into the creature known as Mr. Freeze occurred during his desperate attempt to sabotage the weapons development program and rescue his wife from corporate custody before her life support systems could be compromised. By budget cuts or deliberate neglect, The prototype cryogenic weapon that malfunctioned during the struggle between Victor and corporate security forces had been designed to operate at temperatures so extreme that brief exposure would cause instantaneous frostbite and very potential death. Yet its effects upon Victor's biochemistry were far more profound and permanent than anyone could have anticipated. The cellular changes that resulted from Victor's exposure to the experimental cryogenic energies occurred at a fundamental level that transcended simple tissue damage or environmental adaptation, rewriting his basic biological processes in ways that made normal human existence impossible, while granting him capabilities that no natural evolutionary process could have produced. His body temperature dropped to levels that would have been instantly fatal to any normal human being, while his cardiovascular and respiratory systems adapted to function efficiently in conditions that would have caused immediate organ failure in others. The psychological impact of this transformation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical changes, for Victor found himself cut off from all normal human contact and sensation, unable to experience warmth or comfort, or any of the simple pleasures that had once made life worth living. The suit that he was forced to construct in order to survive in normal atmospheric conditions became both his salvation and his prison, preserving his existence while ensuring that he could never again know the simple joy of human touch or the comfort of physical intimacy with the woman he loved. The first priority that drove Victor's actions following his transformation was the recovery of Nora from GothCorp's custody, a goal that would require him to overcome not only the corporation's security measures, but also the psychological barriers that his new condition created in his relationships with other human beings. The weapons that he constructed using his knowledge of cryogenic technology were intended not for conquest or criminal enterprise, but simply as tools necessary to achieve the reunion with his wife that had become the sole remaining purpose of his existence. The raid upon Wayne Manor that brought Mr. Freeze into direct conflict with Bruce Wayne, and eventually with Batman, represented Victor's first major attempt to secure the resources necessary for Nora's continued preservation and potential cure. The choice of Ferris Boyle's awards ceremony as the target for this operation was not coincidental, but rather reflected Victor's desire to achieve both practical and symbolic objectives through a single, carefully planned action that would demonstrate the consequences of corporate betrayal, while providing him with access to the man responsible for his current condition. The ice-based weapons that Freeze employed during his assault on Wayne Manor were marvels of applied cryogenic technology, capable of instantly reducing temperatures in localized areas to levels that would immobilize or kill anyone exposed to them, while leaving the surrounding environment relatively unaffected. The precision with which these devices operated reflected both Victor's scientific expertise and his determination to achieve his objectives without causing unnecessary harm to innocent bystanders who had played no role in creating his current situation. The terror that Freeze's appearance inspired among the guests at the awards ceremony was based not merely upon his unusual appearance or his obvious willingness to use violence, but also upon the inhuman coldness that seemed to radiate from his very being, suggesting a form of existence so fundamentally different from normal human experience that it challenged basic assumptions about the nature of life itself. His mechanical voice and emotionless delivery of ultimatums created an atmosphere of dread that exceeded what any conventional criminal could have achieved through simple threats or displays of weapons. Bruce Wayne's initial encounter with Mr. Freeze during the attack on his home provided him with crucial insights into the psychology and motivations of this new adversary, revealing that beneath the frightening exterior lay a mind driven not by greed or power lust, but by love and desperation that had been twisted into something approaching obsession through trauma and isolation. The recognition that Victor's actions were motivated by genuinely noble intentions, however misguided their expression might be, would influence Batman's approach to their subsequent confrontations, and his ultimate strategy for resolving the conflict. The revelation of the history between Victor Fries and Ferris Boyle that Batman uncovered through his investigation of Gothcorp's records provided him with the context necessary to understand not only the immediate threat that Fries represented, but also the broader implications of corporate malfeasance and the responsibility that supposedly legitimate businesses bore for creating the conditions that produced such desperate responses. The weapons development program that had corrupted Victor's humanitarian research served as a perfect example of how the pursuit of profit could pervert even the most noble scientific endeavors. The moral complexity of the situation that Batman faced in dealing with Mr. Freeze extended far beyond the simple question of stopping a dangerous criminal to encompass deeper issues of justice, responsibility, and the proper response to genuine grievances that had been expressed through illegal means. Victor's transformation into a creature of ice and vengeance was clearly the direct result of corporate betrayal and criminal negligence. Yet his methods of seeking redress threatened innocent lives and violated fundamental principles of civilized behavior. The tracking operation that led Batman to Freeze's final confrontation with Boyle at the Gothcorp facility demonstrated both the detective skills that made him uniquely qualified to unravel complex criminal conspiracies and his big commitment to resolving conflicts in ways that serve justice rather than mere law enforcement. The specialized equipment that he acquired to operate effectively in the sub-zero environment that Freeze's presence created showed his willingness to adapt his methods to meet unprecedented challenges while maintaining his core principles. The extreme environment batsuit that Lucius Fox had developed for operations in hostile conditions proved essential to Batman's ability to function in the areas that Freeze had converted into frozen wastelands through the application of his cryogenic technology. The suit's heating systems and environmental controls allowed Batman to maintain normal body temperature and motor function, even when surrounded by temperatures that would have caused hypothermia and death within minutes for anyone lacking such protection. The final confrontation between Batman, Mr. Freeze, and Ferris Boyle in the depths of the Gothcorp facility brought together all the moral and practical complexities that had been developing throughout the case, creating a situation where simple applications of force would be inadequate to achieve a just resolution. The death trap that Freeze had prepared for Boyle, involving the same cryogenic technology that preserved Nora's life, represented both poetic justice and a fundamental violation of the principles that should govern civilized responses to criminal behavior. Batman's appeal to whatever remained of Victor's humanity beneath his frozen exterior reflected his understanding that true justice required addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior rather than merely punishing its symptoms. The argument that killing Boyle would accomplish nothing positive while destroying Victor's last connection to his former identity as a healer and protector of life was based upon genuine insight into the psychology of revenge and its paucity, ultimate futility as a source of lasting satisfaction. The tragic irony of Victor's condition, which had stripped him of the ability to feel physical sensations while leaving his emotional responses intact, meant that his love for Nora remained as powerful as ever, even though he could no longer experience the simple pleasures of human contact that had once given that love its concrete expression. The preservation of her life had become an abstract principle rather than a lived reality, transforming their relationship into something approaching religious devotion to an ideal that could never again be fully realized. The resolution of the immediate crisis through Batman's intervention and the restoration of Nora's life support systems provided a temporary solution to the most pressing aspects of the situation. Yet it could not address the deeper tragedy of Victor's transformation, or the fundamental impossibility of reversing the changes that had been wrought upon his biochemistry. The best that could be achieved was the preservation of what remained of his humanity while ensuring that his legitimate grievances received appropriate attention from the legal system. The arrest of Ferris Boyle and the exposure of GothCorp's illegal weapons development program represented a significant victory for justice and corporate accountability, demonstrating that even wealthy and powerful individuals could be held responsible for their actions when sufficient evidence of their crimes could be assembled and presented to appropriate authorities. The scandal that resulted from these revelations would have lasting effects upon the corporate culture in Gotham and beyond, serving as a warning to other executives who might be tempted to pursue similar programs. The ongoing tragedy of Victor and Nora Fries, however, remained essentially unchanged, despite the resolution of the immediate crisis that had brought them to Batman's attention. The degenerative disease that threatened Nora's life continued its relentless progression, even while she remained in cryogenic suspension, while Victor's transformed condition made it impossible for him to pursue the research necessary to develop a cure through normal scientific channels. Their love story had become frozen in time like Nora herself, preserved, but never able to progress toward the happy ending that they both deserved. The lessons that Batman learned from his encounter with Mr. Freeze would influence his approach to similar cases throughout his career, teaching him the importance of understanding the personal motivations that drove individuals to criminal behavior and the necessity of addressing systemic problems that created conditions conducive to such desperate responses. The recognition that some of his adversaries were victims as much as perpetrators would lead him to develop more sophisticated strategies for resolving conflicts that serve justice rather than mere punishment. The broader implications of the Freeze case extended beyond the immediate participants to encompass questions about corporate responsibility, scientific ethics, and the proper balance between innovation and safety in research environments. The weapons development program that had corrupted Victor's humanitarian research served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing profit motives to override moral considerations in the pursuit of technological advancement. The public response to the revelations about GothCorp's activities and Victor Freeze's transformation demonstrated both the capacity of democratic institutions to hold powerful interests accountable when provided with adequate information, and the importance of investigative journalism and vigilant oversight in preventing similar abuses from occurring in the future. The media attention that surrounded the case helped to establish precedents for corporate accountability that would influence regulatory approaches to similar research programs. Yet, perhaps the most profound lesson of the entire affair was the demonstration of how love, even when twisted by tragedy and transformed by desperate circumstances into something approaching obsession, could remain a force for both creation and destruction depending upon the choices made by those who experienced its power. Victor's dedication to preserving Nora's life had led him to achievements in cryogenic technology that advanced human knowledge significantly, yet that same dedication had also driven him to actions that threatened innocent lives and violated fundamental moral principles. The final image of Victor Fries, reunited with his preserved wife, yet separated from her by barriers that no amount of love or scientific knowledge could overcome, served as a poignant reminder of the limitations that mortality and circumstance could impose upon even the most devoted relationships. Their story had become a modern tragedy in the classical sense, demonstrating how noble intentions and genuine love could lead to suffering and loss when they encountered forces beyond human control or understanding. The winter that had begun with snow and celebration ended with the understanding that some forms of cold could never be thawed, that some forms of isolation could never be overcome, and that some forms of love could never find their complete expression in the physical world. Yet within that tragedy lay also a form of beauty, the recognition that human beings could sacrifice everything, including their own humanity, in service of principles and relationships that transcended individual survival and personal happiness. In the shadows cast by Gotham's towering monuments to human ambition and architectural achievement, there existed relationships forged not through blood or marriage, but through shared dedication to principles that transcended individual safety and comfort. Bonds created in the crucible of danger and strengthened through countless nights of standing together against forces that sought to drag the city deeper into chaos and despair. These were the connections that transformed Batman from a solitary figure of vengeance into the center of something approaching a family, though one bound together by choice rather than genetics, by mission rather than mere affection. The young woman who would become both Batgirl and Oracle began her journey toward heroism, not in the training halls of distant masters or the laboratories of brilliant scientists, but in the ordinary circumstances of a police commissioner's household, where dinner conversations frequently turned to discussions of crime statistics and procedural challenges, where the abstract concept of justice took on concrete meaning through daily exposure to its practical applications and limitations. Barbara Gordon's childhood was shaped by her father's unwavering commitment to law enforcement and his genuine belief that systematic effort and institutional reform could eventually triumph over the forces of corruption and violence that threatened civilized society. The idealism that characterized Barbara's early worldview was neither naive nor uninformed, but rather the product of careful observation and logical analysis of the evidence surrounding her throughout her formative years. She had witnessed firsthand her father's gradual transformation from skeptical veteran to cautious ally of Batman, had seen how their partnership had produced results that neither could have achieved independently, had recognized that conventional approaches to crime fighting, however well-intentioned and professionally executed, were insufficient to address the scope and sophistication of the threats facing Gotham. The decision to create her own costume and adopt the identity of Batgirl was not an impulsive act of teenage rebellion, but rather the culmination of months of careful preparation and training, undertaken with the same methodical approach that characterized her academic studies and her analysis of Batman's documented techniques. Her background in martial arts and gymnastics provided the physical foundation necessary for vigilante activities, while her extensive reading in criminology and forensic science supplied the theoretical knowledge required to conduct effective investigations. The first public appearance of Batgirl during the Killer Moth incident at the GCPD demonstration established both her capabilities and her commitment to operating according to the same moral principles that guided Batman's mission, though her methods and motivations reflected her unique perspective as someone who had grown up within the law enforcement community rather than outside it. Her rescue of Commissioner Gordon demonstrated not only her physical skills, but also her understanding of the symbolic importance of protecting those who serve the public good, even at considerable personal risk. The initial skepticism that Batman expressed regarding Barbara's decision to enter the world of costumed crime fighting was based not upon doubts about her abilities or dedication, but rather upon his intimate knowledge of the psychological and physical toll that such activities inevitably exacted from those who pursued them with the intensity necessary for effectiveness. His warnings about the dangerous nature of her chosen path reflected genuine concern for her well-being, rather than any desire to exclude her from his mission or underestimate her potential contributions. The evolution of their working relationship from mutual wariness to genuine partnership occurred gradually, as repeated encounters with dangerous situations demonstrated that Barbara's presence enhanced rather than complicated Batman's ability to protect innocent lives and apprehend criminals. Her different approach to problem solving, influenced by her background in conventional law enforcement and her more optimistic view of human nature, provided alternative perspectives that often proved crucial to understanding complex cases and developing effective strategies. The technical expertise that Barbara developed through years of working with police computer systems and forensic databases made her uniquely valuable as an information specialist, capable of accessing and analyzing data from sources that were often unavailable to Batman through his more conventional investigative methods. Her position within the law enforcement community provided her with insights into official investigations and bureaucratic processes that complemented Batman's street-level intelligence gathering and surveillance activities. The tragic shooting that left Barbara paralyzed from the waist down represented one of the darkest moments in Batman's war against crime, forcing him to confront the reality that his mission inevitably placed those closest to him in mortal danger, regardless of their own skills or precautionary measures. The Joker's assault upon Barbara was motivated not by any personal animosity toward her, but rather by his desire to prove philosophical points about the fragility of sanity and the arbitrary nature of suffering, making her both victim and unwilling participant in his ongoing psychological warfare against Batman. The transformation from Batgirl to Oracle that followed Barbara's injury demonstrated her remarkable resilience and her refusal to allow physical limitations to prevent her from continuing to serve the cause of justice in whatever capacity remained available to her. The computer systems and communication networks that she established in her clock tower headquarters became force multipliers that enhanced the effectiveness of every hero who operated within Gotham and beyond, providing real-time intelligence and tactical support that often proved decisive in critical situations. The role that Oracle played in coordinating information and resources among the various members of Batman's extended network represented a fundamental evolution in the nature of vigilante justice, transforming what had been essentially solo operations into sophisticated team efforts that could address multiple threats simultaneously while maintaining the flexibility and independence that made costumed heroes effective where conventional law enforcement struggled. The recruitment of Dick Grayson as the first Robin occurred under circumstances that paralleled Batman's own origin story in several crucial respects, involving the violent death of loving parents and the creation of an orphan whose grief and desire for justice could either be channeled toward constructive purposes or allowed to fester into something darker and more destructive. The circus performance that ended with the sabotage of the Flying Grayson's trapeze equipment demonstrated once again how criminal enterprises reached into every aspect of Gotham society, corrupting even venues dedicated to innocent entertainment and family enjoyment. The decision to take Dick into Wayne Manor and eventually to train him as a partner in crime-fighting activities was not made lightly, for Batman understood better than anyone the psychological burdens and physical dangers that such a life would inevitably entail. Yet his recognition of the similarities between Dick's situation and his own, combined with his growing awareness that the scope of Gotham's problems required resources and capabilities beyond what any individual could provide, led him to conclude that offering the boy a chance to channel his pain into purposeful action was preferable to leaving him to struggle alone with trauma that might otherwise consume him. The training regimen that Dick underwent was comprehensive and demanding, encompassing not only the physical conditioning and combat techniques necessary for survival in dangerous situations, but also the detective skills and analytical capabilities required to conduct effective investigations and develop tactical plans appropriate to complex criminal enterprises. The emphasis placed upon non-lethal methods and the preservation of innocent life reflected Batman's commitment to ensuring that his protégé would not repeat the mistakes or succumb to the temptations that had claimed other vigilantes throughout history. The partnership between Batman and Robin that developed over years of working together represented one of the most effective crime-fighting teams in Gotham's history, combining Batman's experience and resources with Robin's agility and fresh perspective to create a force that was genuinely greater than the sum of its individual components. Their complementary skills and mutual trust allowed them to undertake operations that would have been impossible for either to attempt alone, while their shared commitment to justice provided the moral foundation necessary to maintain their effectiveness without compromising their principles. The gradual evolution of Dick Grayson from dependent ward to independent partner reflected both his personal growth and Batman's recognition that effective mentorship required allowing protégés to develop their own approaches to dawn shared challenges rather than simply replicating the mentor's methods and perspectives. The emergence of tensions between their different philosophies and tactical preferences was a natural consequence of Dick's maturation and his increasing confidence in his own judgment and capabilities. The decision for Dick to leave Gotham and establish his own heroic identity as Nightwing in the neighboring city of Bloodhaven represented both a personal triumph and a source of profound loss for Batman, demonstrating that successful mentorship inevitably led to independence, while also depriving him of a partner whose contributions had become integral to his mission's effectiveness. The pride he felt in Dick's achievements was tempered by the loneliness that resulted from operating once again as a solitary figure after years of sharing the burdens and dangers of his chosen path. The tragic story of Jason Todd, the second young man to assume the mantle of Robin, illustrated both the potential benefits and the inherent risks of involving children in adult conflicts, regardless of how noble the underlying purposes might be, or how comprehensive the training and preparation provided to them. Jason's background as a street orphan, who had survived through petty crime and quick thinking, provided him with skills and perspectives that differed significantly from those of his predecessor, making him valuable in certain situations, while also creating challenges that proved difficult to address through conventional mentoring approaches. The psychological profile that Jason presented was more complex and troubled than Dick's had been, reflecting the harsher circumstances of his upbringing and the different forms of trauma that had shaped his worldview and emotional responses. His tendency toward anger and his greater willingness to employ violence as a first resort rather than a last option created ongoing tensions with Batman's philosophy and methods, leading to conflicts that sometimes interfered with their effectiveness as a team. The capture and apparent murder of Jason Todd by the Joker represented Batman's greatest failure as a mentor and protector, forcing him to confront the possibility that his decision to involve young people in his war against crime had directly contributed to the death of someone who had trusted him with their life and safety. The psychological impact of this loss would influence his approach to all subsequent relationships and his willingness to accept help from others who might be placed at risk through association with his mission. The video recording that documented Jason's torture and execution served not only as evidence of the Joker's sadistic nature, but also as a deliberate psychological attack upon Batman himself, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage while demonstrating the futility of trying to protect those who became targets of the Clown Prince of Crime's attention. The timing and presentation of this material reflected careful planning intended to maximize its traumatic impact and create lasting psychological scars that would impair Batman's effectiveness in future encounters. The guilt and self-recrimination that followed Jason's death led Batman to question fundamental aspects of his mission and methods, wondering whether his war against crime caused more harm than good when it resulted in the deaths of innocents who had been drawn into conflicts they were not equipped to handle. The temptation to abandon his crusade entirely was balanced only by his recognition that withdrawing from the field would leave Gotham vulnerable to threats that no other individual or organization was prepared to address. The recruitment of Tim Drake as the third Robin occurred under very different circumstances from those that had brought Dick and Jason into Batman's orbit, involving not personal tragedy or chance encounter, but rather deliberate investigation and analysis by a young man whose intellectual capabilities and deductive skills rivaled those of the world's greatest detective himself. Tim's independent discovery of Batman's secret identity demonstrated both his remarkable analytical abilities and his deep understanding of the patterns and relationships that connected Bruce Wayne's public activities with Batman's crime-fighting operations. The decision to accept Tim as a partner, despite the recent tragedy that had claimed Jason Todd, reflected Batman's recognition that his mission required assistance from others, while also acknowledging Tim's unique qualifications and his determination to involve himself in the fight against crime, regardless of official approval or support. The different approach that Tim brought to the Robin role, emphasizing detective work and strategic analysis over physical confrontation, provided Batman with capabilities that complemented his own skills, while reducing some of the risks that had proven fatal to his predecessor. The family dynamics that developed among the various members of Batman's extended network reflected the complex relationships that could emerge when individuals chose to dedicate themselves to shared purposes that transcended traditional social bonds and conventional definitions of success and achievement. The loyalty and mutual support that characterized these relationships were based not upon legal obligations or blood connections, but upon demonstrated commitment to common values and proven willingness to sacrifice personal interests in service of the greater good. The training and mentoring approaches that Batman employed with each of his protégés were customized to reflect their individual strengths, weaknesses, and psychological needs, demonstrating his understanding that effective leadership required adapting methods to suit particular circumstances, rather than applying uniform techniques, regardless of their appropriateness to specific situations. The success or failure of these relationships depended largely upon his ability to balance protective instincts with recognition of his partner's needs for independence and personal growth. The ongoing challenge of maintaining operational security while building trust and cooperation among team members required constant vigilance and careful consideration of information sharing protocols. For the safety of each individual member depended upon preventing their identities and activities from becoming known to the criminal organizations they opposed. The compartmentalization of sensitive information had to be balanced against the need for coordination and mutual support during dangerous operations. The evolution of these relationships over time reflected both the personal growth of the individuals involved and the changing nature of the threats they faced together. As criminal enterprises became more sophisticated and dangerous adversaries developed more effective methods for targeting costumed heroes and their support networks. The adaptations that became necessary to maintain effectiveness while protecting team members illustrated the dynamic nature of the challenges involved in vigilante justice. The philosophical differences that sometimes emerged among team members regarding appropriate methods and acceptable levels of risk created tensions that required careful management to prevent them from undermining overall effectiveness or causing permanent divisions within the group. The democratic approach that Batman increasingly adopted in making strategic decisions reflected his recognition that the diverse perspectives and expertise of his partners often led to better solutions than those he might develop independently. The impact that these relationships had upon Batman's own psychological development was profound and largely positive, providing him with emotional connections and sources of support that helped prevent the isolation and cynicism that might otherwise have resulted from years of exposure to humanity's darkest impulses and most destructive behaviors. The responsibility he felt for the safety and development of his protégés also served as a counterbalance to any tendencies toward excessive risk-taking or disregard for his own well-being. The legacy that each member of the Bat family created through their individual contributions to the fight against crime extended far beyond their specific achievements, in particular cases to encompass the inspiration they provided to other potential heroes, and the demonstration they offered that ordinary individuals could make extraordinary differences when they committed themselves fully to serving purposes larger than their own personal interests and ambitions. The symbolic importance of the Bat family in Gotham's cultural landscape transformed Batman from a single mysterious figure into a visible representation of the community's commitment to justice and its refusal to accept criminal domination as inevitable, showing that citizens could take active roles in protecting their society, rather than simply hoping that others would solve their problems for them. The ongoing evolution of these relationships and their adaptation to changing circumstances would continue to shape both the effectiveness of Batman's mission and the personal growth of all involved, demonstrating that true heroism was not a solitary achievement, but rather a collaborative effort that drew strength from diversity, mutual support, and shared commitment to principles that transcended individual limitations and temporary setbacks. In the annals of Batman's long war against the forces that sought to drag Gotham City into permanent darkness, no single night would prove more transformative or more revelatory of the true nature of his mission than that evening when he found himself lured to Arkham Asylum under circumstances that seemed routine yet concealed beneath their surface. The most elaborate and psychologically sophisticated trap that had ever been devised to test the limits of his capabilities and the strength of his moral convictions. This was not merely another criminal scheme designed to acquire wealth or eliminate opposition, but rather a carefully orchestrated examination of heroism itself, conducted by minds that understood the deepest principles that govern Batman's choices, and had dedicated themselves to proving that such principles were ultimately unsustainable when confronted with sufficiently complex moral challenges. The conspiracy that brought Batman to Arkham Island on that fateful night had been years in the making, involving coordination among criminal enterprises that normally competed with each other for territory and resources, united only by their shared recognition that the Dark Knight represented an existential threat to their continued operations in Gotham City. The anonymous tips that had led to the capture of Victor Zizars, the Scarecrow, and finally, the Joker himself had been orchestrated with such precision and apparent authenticity that even Batman's legendary suspicions had been insufficient to detect the manipulation that was guiding events toward their predetermined conclusion. The ease with which these arrests had been accomplished should have served as warning that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power between Batman and his adversaries. For criminals of such capability and resources did not typically allow themselves to be captured without elaborate contingency plans and escape mechanisms that would restore their freedom before any meaningful interrogation or legal proceedings could take place. The fact that each apprehension had occurred precisely when and where Batman's investigation had led him suggested either unprecedented good fortune or careful orchestration by individuals who understood his methods and psychological patterns with disturbing accuracy. Arkham Asylum itself represented far more than a simple detention facility for the criminally insane. It was a symbol of society's attempt to address the fundamental questions of how civilization should respond to forms of madness and malevolence that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior. The Gothic architecture that dominated the island complex spoke to earlier eras' understanding of the relationship between physical environment and psychological treatment, reflecting beliefs about the therapeutic value of imposing order and structure upon minds that had been consumed by chaos and unreason. The staff and administrators who operated Arkham under Warden Sharp's leadership were dedicated professionals who had devoted their careers to the challenging task of providing treatment and containment for individuals whose mental conditions made them dangerous to themselves and others. Yet their conventional training and experience had not prepared them for the unique challenges posed by criminals whose psychological disorders were complicated by superhuman abilities or access to advanced technologies that transformed them into threats requiring unprecedented security measures and specialized containment procedures. The decision to transfer numerous inmates from Blackgate Prison to Arkham, following the fire that had damaged the conventional correctional facility, had created overcrowding and logistical challenges that strained the asylum's body, resources and personnel to their breaking points, forcing administrators to implement emergency protocols that prioritized immediate security over long-term therapeutic objectives. The concentration of so many dangerous individuals within a single facility created opportunities for coordination and mutual support among criminal elements that would normally have been kept isolated from each other. The Joker's arrival at Arkham, as Batman's latest capture, was greeted by both staff and inmates as the culmination of a capture campaign that had removed several of Gotham's most dangerous criminals from the streets and placed them in what was theoretically the most secure facility available for their containment and treatment. The elaborate precautions taken during his transport and initial processing reflected the reputation he had earned for escaping from custody, and the understanding that his psychological condition made him particularly dangerous to anyone who attempted to interact with him without proper preparation and protective measures. The medical examination that revealed the Joker's deteriorating condition due to his exposure to the Titan formula during the events at Blackgate Prison provided crucial intelligence about the long-term consequences of the payers. Experimental chemicals that had been developed through the perversion of legitimate scientific research, the progressive breakdown of his organ systems, and the increasingly desperate measures required to maintain his basic life functions created a sense of urgency that would prove to be carefully calculated misdirection designed to encourage specific responses from those who observed his apparent vulnerability. The security protocols that govern movement of high-risk inmates within Arkham's facilities had been developed through years of experience with individuals whose escape attempts had tested every conceivable form of containment, technology, and procedural safeguard. Yet the Joker's knowledge of human psychology and his ability to manipulate the emotions and decision-making processes of his guards and medical staff provided him with advantages that no amount of physical security could but entirely neutralize. His apparent cooperation during the intake process concealed careful observation of personnel patterns and facility layouts that would prove crucial to the success of his ultimate plan. Batman's decision to personally oversee the Joker's transfer to his cell reflected both his commitment to ensuring that dangerous criminals received appropriate treatment within the legal system and his intuitive understanding that something about the entire sequence of arrests and transfers had proceeded too smoothly to be entirely genuine. The conversation with Commissioner Gordon about the potential for trap or ambush demonstrated the collaborative relationship that had developed between Batman and legitimate law enforcement, though it also revealed the limitations that conventional police resources faced when confronting threats that operated according to principles that transcended normal criminal behavior. The moment of the Joker's escape from custody marked the beginning of a night that would test every aspect of Batman's training, preparation, and moral commitment. while also revealing the true scope of the conspiracy that had been developing within Arkham's walls, under cover of legitimate medical and administrative activities. The coordination between Harley Quinn's infiltration of security systems and the Joker's own actions demonstrated planning and resource allocation that exceeded what any individual criminal, regardless of their intelligence or dedication, could have accomplished without assistance from Confederates who possessed intimate knowledge of asylum operations and procedures. The video message that announced Harley Quinn's role in the night's events and her capture of Warden Sharp transformed what had initially appeared to be a simple escape attempt into something far more ambitious and dangerous, suggesting that the entire facility had been compromised and that the elaborate security measures that were supposed to protect both staff and inmates from each other had been turned into weapons that could be used to achieve the opposite of their intended purposes. The reference to the night's events as the Joker's homecoming implied a level of familiarity with Arkham that exceeded what normal detention would have provided. The threat to detonate bombs throughout Gotham City, unless Batman faced the asylum's challenges alone, ensured that the Dark Knight would be isolated from the support systems and backup resources that had become integral to his effectiveness in complex operations, forcing him to rely entirely upon his own capabilities while operating in an environment that had been deliberately modified to maximize the advantages held by his opponents. The psychological warfare implicit in this isolation was as important as any physical trap that might await him within the facility's corridors. The exploration of Arkham's various wings and treatment areas that followed provided Batman with intimate exposure to the full spectrum of mental illness and criminal pathology that Gotham's underworld had produced, demonstrating the variety of ways that human psychology could be distorted or corrupted, while also revealing the tragic waste of potential that characterized many of the facility's residents. The case files and treatment records that he accessed during his investigation painted pictures of individuals whose brilliance or talent had been perverted by trauma, genetic predisposition, or conscious choice into instruments of destruction and suffering. The encounter with Victor Zayas in the midst of threatening a guard revealed the serial killer's particular form of madness, which transformed murder into a compulsive ritual that provided psychological satisfaction while serving no rational purpose beyond the elimination of human life. The tally marks that Zayas carved into his own flesh to commemorate each killing demonstrated the complete disconnection from normal human empathy that characterized his mental condition, while his calm demeanor during violent acts suggested a form of dissociation that made conventional negotiation or reasoning impossible. The rescue of the threatened guard through stealth and precision timing showcased Batman's commitment to preserving innocent life, even when such intervention risked exposing his position to hostile forces that were actively hunting him throughout the facility. The techniques employed to neutralize Zayas without causing permanent injury reflected the non-lethal methods that Batman had perfected through years of training and experience, demonstrating that effective law enforcement could be accomplished without resorting to the same violent methods employed by the criminals being apprehended. The revelation that Harley Quinn had gained access to Arkham's security systems and was actively monitoring Batman's movements through surveillance cameras and sensor networks transformed the asylum from a place of treatment and containment into an elaborate maze designed to test and torment its unwilling participant. The psychological profile that emerged from her communications and actions revealed an individual whose professional medical training had been completely subverted by obsessive devotion to a patient whose manipulative abilities had proven stronger than her therapeutic techniques and ethical constraints. The mutated creature that the Joker released to battle Batman represented the first concrete evidence of the experimental programs that had been conducted within Arkham under cover of legitimate medical research, demonstrating how scientific knowledge and advanced technology could be perverted to create weapons that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. The obvious suffering of the creature and its apparent lack of conscious volition raised disturbing questions about the methods that had been employed in its creation and the number of similar experiments that might have been conducted on unwilling subjects. The Joker's philosophical challenge regarding Batman's refusal to end the confrontation through lethal force revealed the depth of psychological analysis that had gone into designing the Knight's events, demonstrating understanding of the moral principles that governed Batman's choices and the internal conflicts that arose when those principles were tested against practical necessities and emotional pressures. The madman's delight in creating situations where every available option carried unacceptable moral costs reflected his commitment to proving that heroic ideals were ultimately unsustainable when confronted with sufficient complexity and pressure. The video message revealing the corruption of Officer Frank Bowles and the capture of Commissioner Gordon escalated the stakes of the confrontation beyond Batman's personal safety to encompass the lives of individuals whose partnership had become essential to his mission's effectiveness, creating psychological pressure that was designed to impair his decision-making capabilities while also testing his commitment to the principles that prevented him from accepting assistance that might place others at risk. The implicit threat to Gordon's life served multiple purposes within the Joker's overall strategy. The pursuit of Gordon's trail through Arkham's underground areas and service tunnels provided Batman with access to parts of the facility that were not included in official blueprints or administrative records, revealing the extent to which the island's history of psychiatric treatment stretched back through decades of changing approaches to mental illness and criminal rehabilitation. The abandoned treatment areas and obsolete medical equipment that he encountered during this search painted a disturbing picture of therapeutic techniques that had been employed before modern understanding of patient rights and ethical constraints had reformed psychiatric medicine. The discovery of Officer Bowles' corpse and the evidence of his betrayal by the Joker demonstrated the fate that awaited those who chose to collaborate with criminal enterprises in hopes of achieving personal advantage, illustrating the fundamental truth that individuals who abandoned moral principles in pursuit of immediate benefits inevitably became expendable assets whose elimination served their former allies' strategic objectives. The manner of Bowles' death suggested both punishment for failure and a warning to others who might consider similar betrayals. The psychological warfare conducted through the Riddler's hijacking of Batman's communication systems introduced another layer of complexity to the Knight's challenges, transforming navigation through Arkham's facilities into an elaborate puzzle that required intellectual as well as physical capabilities to solve successfully. The riddles and cryptographic challenges that Edward Nygma had embedded throughout the asylum served both as obstacles to Batman's progress and as demonstrations of the intellectual pride that drove his criminal activities, revealing a mind that equated puzzle-solving ability with moral superiority. The series of encounters with Scarecrow and exposure to his fear toxin forced Batman to confront his deepest psychological vulnerabilities and traumatic memories, while operating under extreme stress and time pressure, creating conditions where normal coping mechanisms and rational thought processes were severely impaired by chemically induced anxiety and hallucinatory experiences. The visions of his parents' deaths and his own potential failures as a protector revealed the emotional foundation beneath his commitment to justice, while also demonstrating the psychological toll that his chosen mission exacted from him on a daily basis. The discovery that Commissioner Gordon was alive despite earlier evidence suggesting his death provided relief that was immediately complicated by the realization that the Joker's psychological manipulation had extended to creating false evidence designed to inflict maximum emotional trauma. upon Batman while also testing his ability to function effectively, while believing that his actions had contributed to the death of a valued ally. The rescue of Gordon from Harley Quinn's custody demonstrated the importance of maintaining hope and continuing to pursue objectives, even when circumstances seemed to indicate that such efforts were futile. The confrontation with the enhanced version of Bane that resulted from Dr. Young's Titan experiments revealed the extent to which legitimate scientific research had been corrupted and weaponized to create threats that exceeded anything that conventional law enforcement or even experienced vigilantes had previously been required to face. The creature's combination of massive physical strength, chemical-enhanced aggression, and tactical intelligence created challenges that could not be addressed through normal combat techniques or standard equipment, requiring innovative solutions and careful exploitation of environmental factors. The destruction of the sewer ceiling and Bane's apparent defeat through the collapse of massive stone blocks demonstrated Batman's ability to use his environment as a weapon when direct confrontation proved ineffective, while also illustrating the kind of collateral damage that could result when battles between enhanced individuals occurred in populated areas or critical infrastructure locations. The decision to drive Bane into Gotham Bay through the use of the Batmobile showed how technological resources could be deployed to resolve conflicts that exceeded human-scale capabilities. The secret Batcave that Batman had established on Arkham Island as an emergency facility revealed the depth of his preparation for contingencies and his understanding that effective crime fighting required redundant resources and backup, systems that could function independently of his primary base of operations. The intelligence gathered through the facility's computer systems about Dr. Young's research and the Titan project provided crucial context for understanding the scope of the threats he was facing, while also revealing the connections between seemingly separate criminal enterprises. The destruction of Dr. Young's research notes to prevent their use by criminal organizations demonstrated Batman's commitment to preventing dangerous knowledge from being exploited for harmful purposes, even when such destruction eliminated potential benefits that might have resulted from legitimate applications of the scientific principles involved. The decision to prioritize public safety over scientific advancement reflected the moral framework that guided his choices when competing values created conflicts that required immediate resolution. The rescue of Dr. Young from Victor Zsasz and her subsequent death in the explosion triggered by one of the Joker's booby traps illustrated both the heroic effort required to protect innocent lives and the tragic reality that such efforts could not always succeed, despite the best intentions and most determined actions. The Doctor's final revelation about the Joker's acquisition of her Titan formula provided crucial intelligence about his ultimate objectives, while also serving as a reminder of the price that individuals paid when they became targets of criminal enterprises that operated without moral constraints. The series of encounters with Poison Ivy revealed her unique perspective on the relationship between human civilization and the natural environment, demonstrating how legitimate environmental concerns could be distorted by extremist ideology and personal trauma into justifications for genocidal actions against entire species. Her ability to control and communicate with plant life created challenges that were unlike anything in Batman's previous experience, requiring adaptation of tactical approaches and development of new strategies for dealing with opponents whose capabilities operated according to biological rather than technological principles. The alliance between Poison Ivy and the Joker that resulted from his provision of Titan serum to enhance her abilities demonstrated the potential for cooperation among criminal elements that normally competed with each other, showing how shared opposition to legitimate authority could create temporary partnerships that amplified the individual threats posed by each participant. The transformation of Arkham Island's vegetation into hostile territory controlled by Ivy's enhanced plants created environmental hazards that complicated every subsequent operation. The descent into Killer Croc's lair beneath the asylum to obtain the plant specimens necessary for creating an antidote to the Titan formula required Batman to operate in conditions that favored his opponent's natural advantages, while also dealing with the psychological pressure of knowing that failure would result not only in his own death but also in the success of the Joker's larger plan to transform Gotham's population into an army of enhanced monsters. The primitive intelligence and savage nature of Killer Croc created a different category of challenge than the sophisticated psychological warfare that characterized most of Batman's other adversaries. The preparation of the antidote using the Batcave's medical facilities demonstrated the importance of having comprehensive scientific resources available to address threats that combined criminal enterprise with advanced technology and biological warfare, while also illustrating the collaborative relationship between Batman and Alfred that made such complex operations possible, despite the isolation that vigilante activities normally imposed upon their practitioners. The final confrontation with Poison Ivy in the Botanical Gardens tested Batman's ability to overcome an opponent whose powers had been enhanced to levels that exceeded normal human capabilities, while also demonstrating his commitment to preserving life even when dealing with individuals whose actions threatened the safety of entire populations. The defeat of Ivy and the retreat of her enhanced plant network eliminated one major component of the Joker's plan, while also restoring environmental conditions that made continued operations on the island feasible. The climactic battle in Arkham's Visitor Center brought together all the various threads and challenges that had been developing throughout the night, creating a final examination of Batman's capabilities and moral commitment that would determine not only his immediate survival, but also the fate of everyone who depended upon his protection. The Joker's use of Scarface, the ventriloquist dummy that had driven Arnold Wesker to murder, as a psychological weapon demonstrated his understanding of the symbolic power that certain objects could wield over damaged minds. The revelation that Commissioner Gordon had been captured during his attempted evacuation from the island and was being used as a hostage to force Batman's cooperation in the Joker's final experiment created the ultimate test of the moral principles that governed heroic action, forcing a choice between personal safety and the protection of innocent life that would reveal whether Batman's commitment to justice was genuine or merely a convenient rationalization for vigilante activities motivated by personal, psychological needs. The Joker's attempt to force Batman's transformation through injection with the Titan formula represented the culmination of a psychological campaign designed to prove that anyone could be reduced to a monster given sufficient pressure and chemical influence, challenging the fundamental assumption that heroism was based upon conscious choice rather than favorable circumstances and genetic predisposition. Batman's resistance to the transformation and his use of the antidote to maintain his humanity demonstrated that moral strength could triumph over biological manipulation when supported by sufficient preparation and unwavering commitment to core principles. The final battle against the Titangent Enhanced Joker tested every aspect of Batman's training and preparation, while also serving as a definitive statement about the relationship between physical power and moral authority, proving that intelligence, preparation, and commitment to just principles could overcome even overwhelming advantages in raw strength and chemical enhancement. The defeat of the monstrous creature that the Joker had become vindicated Batman's approach to crime fighting, while also demonstrating the ultimate futility of solutions that relied upon force and intimidation rather than justice and rehabilitation. The aftermath of the night's events, with the recapture of escaped criminals and the restoration of normal operations at Arkham Asylum, provided temporary resolution to the immediate crisis while also revealing the ongoing nature of the challenges that Batman and his allies would continue to face as long as criminal enterprises existed that were willing to exploit human places, weakness, and corruption for their own purposes. The survival of various inmates despite their exposure to experimental chemicals and enhanced combat situations suggested that future encounters would require continued adaptation and development of new strategies and resources. The philosophical implications of the Arkham Asylum incident extended far beyond the immediate tactical and strategic lessons that could be drawn from Batman's successful navigation of the elaborate trap that had been prepared for him, encompassing fundamental questions about the nature of justice, the proper response to mental illness and criminal behavior, and the responsibilities that individuals with extraordinary capabilities bear toward the communities they choose to serve and protect. In the aftermath of the Arkham Asylum crisis, when the immediate threats had been contained and the facility's operations restored to something approaching normal functionality, there emerged from the shadows of political ambition and bureaucratic maneuvering a proposal so audacious and seemingly logical that it would fundamentally transform the landscape of criminal justice in Gotham City while simultaneously creating the conditions for an even more devastating confrontation between the forces of order and chaos. This was the genesis of Arkham City, a concept that represented both the logical extension of existing approaches to managing dangerous criminal populations and a complete abandonment of the principles that should govern civilized society's treatment of those who violated its laws. The political momentum that made Arkham City possible was generated through a combination of legitimate public concern about the recurring failures of traditional incarceration methods and carefully orchestrated manipulation of democratic processes by individuals whose true objectives remained hidden beneath layers of apparent civic responsibility and humanitarian concern. The repeated escapes from both Blackgate Prison and Arkham Asylum had created a climate of fear and frustration among Gotham citizens that made them receptive to radical solutions that might otherwise have been rejected as violations of constitutional principles and human rights. Quincy Sharp's transformation from relatively obscure asylum warden to mayor of Gotham City was accomplished through a media campaign that portrayed him as the heroic administrator whose quick thinking and decisive action had prevented the Arkham crisis from becoming an even greater catastrophe, though the careful observer might have noted discrepancies between this public narrative and the documented evidence of his actual performance during the night in question. The security footage that revealed Sharp's unconsciousness during most of the critical events was either dismissed or explained away through arguments that emphasized his symbolic importance rather than his practical contributions. The support that Sharp received from mysterious benefactors whose identities were carefully concealed from public scrutiny provided him with resources that far exceeded what any individual candidate should have been able to access through normal fundraising channels, suggesting the involvement of powerful interests whose motivations extended beyond simple civic improvement or political reform. The sophisticated nature of the campaign materials and strategic consulting that were employed on Sharp's behalf indicated coordination and expertise that transcended local political organizations. The concept of Arkham City, as it was initially presented to Gotham citizens, appeared to offer solutions to multiple problems that had long plagued the city's approach to criminal justice, promising more effective containment of dangerous individuals, while also reducing the financial burden that traditional incarceration methods placed upon taxpayers and eliminating the recurring security failures that had allowed numerous escapes and public endangerment incidents. The proposal suggested that concentrated supervision within a contained urban environment might actually provide better opportunities for rehabilitation and social reintegration than the isolation and institutional dependency that characterized conventional prison systems. The location selected for this experimental facility was a section of Gotham that had already been largely abandoned by legitimate businesses and law-abiding residents, an area where urban decay and economic decline had created conditions that made normal municipal services increasingly difficult to maintain, and where property values had fallen to levels that made large-scale acquisition financially feasible. The transformation of this blighted district into a controlled environment for criminal populations was presented as urban renewal that would eliminate a source of civic embarrassment while providing productive use for resources that had otherwise become liabilities. The private military contractor that was hired to provide security for Arkham City operated under the designation Tiger, a name that suggested both predatory efficiency and the kind of aggressive approach to law enforcement that conventional police departments were legally and ethically prohibited from employing. The personnel recruited for this organization were drawn primarily from military and intelligence backgrounds, individuals whose training and experience had prepared them for operations in hostile territory against armed opponents who did not enjoy the protections normally afforded to civilian populations. The psychological conditioning that Tiger operatives underwent as part of their preparation for duty within Arkham City included exposure to advanced indoctrination techniques designed to eliminate normal moral hesitation about employing violence against designated targets, while also fostering absolute loyalty to the organization's command structure and operational objectives. The use of chemical enhancement and behavioral modification technologies in this training process raised disturbing questions about the nature of informed consent and the ethical boundaries that should govern military-civilian cooperation in domestic law enforcement activities. Hugo Strange's role as the architect and primary administrator of the Arkham City project remained largely concealed from public view, with his involvement presented through intermediaries and shell organizations that obscured the extent of his authority over operational decisions and strategic planning. His background as a psychiatric researcher, whose previous work had violated numerous professional ethics guidelines and legal restrictions, should have disqualified him from any involvement in criminal justice administration. Yet the carefully constructed facade of legitimacy that surrounded the project prevented adequate scrutiny of its leadership and methodologies. The scientific research programs that Strange established within Arkham City, under the cover of studying criminal behavior and developing improved rehabilitation techniques, actually represented continuation and expansion of the illegal experimentation that had characterized his earlier career, now conducted with official sanction and unlimited access to unwilling human subjects, whose rights had been effectively eliminated through their classification as enemies of civilized society. The monitoring and data collection systems that were installed throughout the facility provided unprecedented opportunities for observing human behavior under extreme stress, while also testing the effectiveness of various psychological manipulation, and social control techniques. The division of Arkham City into territories controlled by different criminal organizations was not an accidental result of inadequate planning or insufficient security measures, but rather a deliberate strategy designed to create controlled conflict situations that would provide valuable intelligence about criminal psychology and organizational dynamics, while also serving the ulterior motives of individuals whose true objectives remained hidden beneath the project's official humanitarian mission. The apparent chaos that characterized daily life within the facility concealed systematic observation and manipulation of events by administrators who viewed the inmates as experimental subjects rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and legal protections. The Joker's establishment of headquarters within the old Sionis Industries building and his proclamation as self-appointed mayor of Arkham City represented both a manifestation of his megalomaniacal personality and a recognition of the unique opportunities that the facility's structure provided for implementing his chaotic philosophy on a scale that had previously been impossible to achieve. His ability to attract followers and establish a functional criminal organization within the confined environment demonstrated the leadership capabilities that made him so dangerous when his intelligence was applied to destructive rather than constructive purposes. The uneasy alliance between the Joker and Harley Quinn that characterized their rule over their section of Arkham City revealed the complex psychological dynamics that governed their relationship, combining genuine affection with manipulative exploitation in ways that made it difficult for outside observers to determine whether their partnership was based upon mutual benefit or predatory domination. Harley's devotion to the Joker, despite his obvious disregard for her well-being, illustrated the powerful hold that charismatic psychopaths could exercise over individuals whose own psychological vulnerabilities made them susceptible to such influence. The Penguin's control over the museum district and his establishment of the Iceberg Lounge as a center for black market commerce and criminal networking demonstrated his business acumen and his ability to adapt traditional organized crime structures to the unique conditions that existed within Arkham City. His collection of weapons and artifacts within the museum setting reflected both his appreciation for historical objects and his understanding of how symbolic displays of power could be used to maintain authority over subordinates, intimidate potential rivals. The territories controlled by other criminal leaders within Arkham City each reflected the psychological profiles and operational preferences of their respective rulers, creating a diverse ecosystem of criminal activity that provided Strange and his associates with comprehensive data about the full spectrum of antisocial behavior and organizational dysfunction. The conflicts between these various factions served multiple purposes within the facility's hidden experimental framework, while also providing entertainment for observers who viewed the inmates' struggles as a form of elaborate, gladiatorial combat. Batman's infiltration of Arkham City represented both a tactical necessity for protecting Gotham's population from the threats that were being incubated within the facility, and a personal mission to rescue individuals whose incarceration had been based upon political expediency rather than legitimate criminal justice procedures. His discovery that the facility's true purpose extended far beyond simple containment of dangerous criminals forced him to confront questions about the nature of legitimate authority and the circumstances under which vigilante action might be justified against officially sanctioned but morally corrupt governmental programs. The investigation that led Batman to uncover Hugo Strange's involvement in the Arkham City project revealed the extent to which legitimate institutions could be corrupted and perverted when they fell under the control of individuals whose personal agendas superseded their professional obligations and ethical responsibilities. Strange's knowledge of Batman's secret identity created additional complications that transformed the conflict from a straightforward law enforcement operation into a complex psychological warfare campaign, where traditional approaches to crime fighting were insufficient to address the scope and sophistication of the opposition. The Protocol 10 initiative that Strange had developed as the ultimate expression of his vision for solving Gotham's criminal problems represented a logical extension of the dehumanization and systematic oppression that characterized the Arkham City experiment, proposing the elimination of unwanted populations through methods that could be justified as necessary responses to public safety emergencies. The weapons systems and targeting protocols that had been developed to implement this program demonstrated the technological capabilities that authoritarian regimes could deploy when democratic oversight and constitutional protections were suspended in the name of crisis management. The complex relationships between Strange, Ra's al Ghul, and the various criminal organizations operating within Arkham City created a web of competing interests and hidden agendas that made it difficult for even experienced investigators to determine the true lines of authority and influence that governed events within the facility. The ecological approach to criminal management that these shadowy figures had developed treated human beings as statistical units whose behavior could be predicted and controlled through the manipulation of environmental conditions and social pressures. The Joker's gradual deterioration due to his continued exposure to the Titan formula and his desperate search for a cure that would allow him to continue his campaign of chaos and destruction created additional urgency and complexity within the already volatile situation that existed in Arkham City. His decision to infect Batman and numerous innocent civilians with his poisoned blood represented both a manifestation of his vindictive nature and a strategic calculation designed to force the Dark Knight to abandon his moral principles in order to secure access to life-saving treatment. The moral dilemma that Batman faced when confronted with the choice between allowing the Joker to die from his self-inflicted condition and providing him with the medical treatment that would restore his ability to commit further atrocities illustrated the fundamental tension between justice and mercy that characterized the hero's entire approach to crime fighting. The recognition that saving the Joker's life would inevitably lead to more innocent deaths forced Batman to confront the limitations of moral absolutism when applied to situations involving individuals whose patterns of behavior had demonstrated complete immunity to rehabilitation or reform. The involvement of Ra's al Ghul and his daughter Talia in the events surrounding Arkham City added layers of personal complexity to what might otherwise have been a straightforward conflict between criminal organizations, legitimate authority, forcing Batman to navigate relationships that combined romantic attachment with fundamental disagreements about the proper methods for achieving social reform and environmental protection. The League of Assassins' philosophy of eco-terrorism and population control through selective elimination provided ideological justification for programs that were indistinguishable from genocide when implemented on a sufficient scale. The Lazarus Pit technology that had sustained Ra's al Ghul's extended lifespan while gradually corrupting his sanity and moral reasoning demonstrated the dangers inherent in attempts to transcend natural biological limitations through artificial means, showing how the pursuit of immortality could lead to the gradual erosion of the very qualities that made continued existence meaningful and valuable. The offer of eternal life that Ra's extended to Batman was simultaneously genuine gift and sophisticated trap, designed to corrupt the hero's moral clarity through the temptation of unlimited time to accomplish his mission of protecting the innocent. The trial by combat that Ra's demanded as proof of Batman's worthiness to inherit leadership of the League of Assassins served multiple purposes within the ancient assassin's strategic framework, providing both a test of physical capabilities and an opportunity to observe how Batman's moral principles would respond to lethal combat against an opponent whose death would eliminate a significant threat to global stability. The refusal to kill, even under such extreme circumstances, demonstrated the strength of Batman's commitment to his ethical code, while also revealing the practical limitations that such commitment imposed upon his ability to permanently resolve conflicts with recurring adversaries. The destruction of the Lazarus Pit during Batman's battle with Ra's al Ghul eliminated one potential source of continued conflict, while also ensuring that the corrupting influence of artificial immortality would not tempt future generations of would-be world leaders and criminal masterminds. The environmental damage that resulted from this action was justified by the prevention of greater harm that would have resulted from allowing such dangerous technology to remain accessible to individuals whose moral development had not kept pace with their temporal longevity. The final confrontation between Batman and the Joker in the abandoned theater beneath Arkham City brought together all the philosophical and personal themes that had been developing throughout their extended conflict, creating a definitive test of both characters' fundamental nature and ultimate objectives. The elaborate deception involving Clayface's impersonation of the Joker demonstrated the level of planning and coordination that had gone into creating this climactic encounter, while also revealing the depth of psychological analysis that the real Joker had conducted regarding Batman's predictable responses to specific stimuli and situations. The death of Talia al Ghul during this confrontation represented both a personal tragedy for Batman and a symbolic victory for the forces of chaos over those who sought to impose order through intelligent planning and systematic reform efforts. Her sacrifice to protect Batman from the Joker's final gambit illustrated the capacity for love to transcend ideological differences and personal safety considerations, while also demonstrating the ultimate price that was often paid by those who chose to involve themselves in conflicts between irreconcilable moral philosophies. The destruction of the underground Lazarus Pit and the apparent death of the Joker provided resolution to immediate threats, while also creating conditions for future conflicts that would test Batman's ability to maintain his mission's effectiveness in the absence of his most persistent and psychologically sophisticated adversary. The knowledge that the Joker's death had been caused partially by Batman's own actions created psychological burdens that would influence his subsequent approach to similar moral dilemmas and his willingness to accept responsibility for consequences that resulted from adherence to ethical principles. The aftermath of the Arkham City incident demonstrated both the potential for democratic institutions to respond effectively to corruption and abuse of authority when provided with adequate information, and the ongoing vulnerability of such institutions to manipulation by individuals who possessed sufficient resources and understanding of psychological influence techniques. The closure of the facility and the arrest of those responsible for its operation provided temporary vindication for principles of justice and human dignity, while also revealing the constant vigilance that was required to prevent similar abuses from occurring in different forms and locations. The broader implications of the Arkham City experiment extended beyond the immediate participants and their fates to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of criminal justice, the proper relationship between security and liberty in democratic societies, and the responsibilities that individuals and communities bore for preventing the conditions that created both criminals and the authoritarian responses that such criminals could be used to justify. The recognition that well-intentioned citizens could be manipulated into supporting programs that violated their own fundamental values provided sobering lessons about the importance of maintaining critical thinking and ethical awareness, even when confronted with apparently compelling arguments for radical solutions to complex social problems. In the hushed corridors of power where political ambitions intersected with criminal enterprise, where the machinery of democratic governance ground against the hidden gears of conspiracy and manipulation, there emerged in the wake of Arkham City's destruction a period of seeming calm that concealed beneath its surface the seeds of conflicts yet to come, transformations yet to unfold, and revelations that would test the very foundations upon which Gotham's fragile peace had been constructed. This was not the ending that many had hoped for, but rather an intermission in a larger drama whose final acts would demand sacrifices and moral choices that would redefine the nature of heroism itself in a city that had become a battleground for the human soul. The closure of Arkham City and the exposure of Hugo Strange's machinations had provided temporary vindication for those who believed that democratic institutions could ultimately triumph over authoritarian ambitions when citizens remained vigilant and committed to the principles of justice and human dignity. Yet the very ease with which such an elaborate conspiracy had been constructed and implemented served as a sobering reminder of how vulnerable civilized society remained to individuals who possessed sufficient intelligence, resources, and moral flexibility to exploit the trust and good intentions that made democratic governance possible in the first place. The political aftermath that followed Mayor Sharp's resignation and the revelations about his role in the Arkham City project created opportunities for reform and renewal within Gotham's governmental structures. Yet, it also demonstrated how quickly public attention could shift from complex systemic issues to simpler narratives that offered clear heroes and villains without requiring sustained engagement with the underlying conditions that had made such abuses possible. The media coverage that accompanied these events focused primarily upon individual personalities and dramatic confrontations, rather than the institutional failures and cultural attitudes that had enabled corruption to flourish unchecked for so long. Commissioner Gordon's gradual assumption of additional responsibilities within the city's power structure reflected both his proven integrity and his intimate understanding of the challenges that faced any administrator who sought to maintain effective law enforcement, while also respecting constitutional limitations and ethical constraints. His partnership with Batman had provided him with insights into the scope and sophistication of criminal enterprises that operated beyond the reach of conventional police methods, while also demonstrating the importance of maintaining accountability and oversight even when dealing with individuals whose motivations appeared to be entirely altruistic. The dispersal of former Arkham City inmates throughout Gotham's various detention facilities and treatment centers created logistical challenges that strained resources while also raising questions about the most effective approaches to rehabilitation and social reintegration for individuals whose criminal careers had been shaped by exposure to the unique conditions that had existed within the experimental facility. The psychological profiles developed during their incarceration revealed patterns of behavior and attitude that transcended simple criminal motivation to encompass broader questions about identity, community, and the human need for purpose and recognition. The investigation into the various corporate entities that had provided funding and logistical support for the Arkham City project revealed connections and relationships that extended far beyond Gotham's borders, suggesting that the conspiracy had been part of a larger network of individuals and organizations whose objectives included not merely local political control, but fundamental transformation of democratic institutions throughout the realm. Developed world. The financial records and communication intercepts that were recovered during these investigations painted a disturbing picture of coordination between seemingly legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises that shared common interests in reducing governmental oversight and public accountability. Harley Quinn's psychological condition following the Joker's death presented unique challenges for the medical professionals and criminal justice administrators who were responsible for her treatment and containment, as her devotion to her deceased partner had evolved into a form of grief-induced psychosis that combined genuine emotional trauma with elaborate fantasy constructions designed to deny the reality of her loss. Her periodic episodes of apparent lucidity were often followed by violent outbursts that reflected her inability to accept that the central relationship of her adult life had been permanently severed by circumstances beyond her control. The makeshift shrine that Harley constructed within her cell at the renovated detention facility became a focal point for both her own psychological processes and the concerns of administrators who worried that her continued veneration of the Joker might inspire similar devotion among other inmates who had been influenced by his charismatic leadership during their time in Arkham City. The items she collected and arranged as memorial objects included photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal artifacts that painted a romanticized portrait of their relationship that bore little resemblance to the manipulative and abusive dynamic that had actually characterized their interactions. The recurring escape attempts that marked Harley's incarceration demonstrated both her resourcefulness and her determination to continue the Joker's work through whatever means remained available to her. Though her plans and objectives often reflected the confused thinking and emotional instability that had resulted from prolonged exposure to his psychological manipulation techniques. Her recruitment of other inmates and her attempts to establish a criminal organization based upon the Joker's methods revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of the qualities that had made him uniquely dangerous and effective as a force for chaos and destruction. The steel mill operation that Harley organized as a memorial to the Joker and a challenge to Batman represented both her most ambitious post-Arkham City scheme and a manifestation of her inability to develop original criminal strategies that were not simply crude imitations of her former partner's elaborate psychological warfare campaigns. The capture of GCPD officers and the creation of elaborate death traps reflected her study of the Joker's methods, yet lacked the philosophical sophistication and symbolic complexity that had made his schemes genuinely threatening to Batman's moral framework and psychological stability. Robin's role in the steel mill rescue operation demonstrated his continued development as an independent hero capable of conducting complex operations without direct supervision, while also revealing the ongoing risks that Batman's mission created for all members of his extended family and support network. The psychological pressure that resulted from believing Batman had been killed in Harley's explosion tested Tim Drake's emotional resilience and his commitment to the principles that had originally motivated his decision to join the fight against crime in Gotham's darkest corners. The revelation that Batman had survived the steel mill explosion and that his apparent death had been another of the elaborate deceptions that characterized his approach to dealing with enemies who sought to target his allies demonstrated both his tactical sophistication and his willingness to accept personal risk in order to protect those who had chosen to support his mission. The coordination required to stage such a convincing false death while maintaining operational security and ensuring that genuine rescue efforts could proceed unimpeded reflected the complex planning capabilities that made Batman uniquely effective against opponents who relied upon psychological manipulation and elaborate schemes. The various criminal enterprises that emerged in the power vacuum created by the Joker's death and the dismantling of Arkham City's artificial criminal ecosystem demonstrated the fluid nature of Gotham's underworld and the relentless speed with which new threats could evolve to exploit changing conditions and available opportunities. The alliances and rivalries that formed among surviving members of different criminal organizations reflected both the personal relationships that had developed during their shared incarceration and the strategic calculations that governed their attempts to establish territorial control and resource access in the post-Arkham City environment. The Riddler's ambitious scheme to position himself as the Joker's intellectual successor through the creation of elaborate puzzle-based death traps and ransom demands revealed both his genuine capabilities as a strategic thinker and his fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological dynamics that had made the Joker uniquely dangerous to Batman and Gotham's population. The robotic guardians and mechanical challenges that Edward Nygma deployed throughout the city demonstrated impressive engineering skills, yet lacked the philosophical depth and personal resonance that had made the Joker's schemes genuinely threatening to Batman's core identity and mission. The collaboration between Batman and Robin that was required to solve the Riddler's puzzles and prevent his execution of innocent civilians showcased the complementary skills and perspectives that made their partnership effective, while also highlighting the ongoing evolution of their relationship from mentor-student dynamic to genuine collaboration between equals who brought different strengths and approaches to shared challenges. The physical separation that the Riddler's scheme imposed upon them forced each to operate independently while maintaining coordination and communication through technological means that tested their trust and mutual understanding. The Penguin's renewed attempts to establish criminal dominance through traditional organized crime methods contrasted sharply with the more exotic approaches employed by other Arkham City veterans, reflecting his preference for business-like criminal enterprises that operated according to comprehensible rules and objectives rather than the chaotic and unpredictable methods that had been pioneered by the Joker and adopted by some of his admirers. The recruitment of Mr. Hammer and Sickle as enforcers demonstrated his understanding of the importance of reliable muscle and intimidation capabilities in maintaining organizational discipline and territorial control. The family dynamics within Wayne Manor during this period reflected the ongoing tension between Bruce Wayne's public responsibilities as a prominent citizen and philanthropist and his private mission as Batman, as the demands of both roles continued to expand in response to the changing nature of the threats facing Gotham and the growing complexity of the criminal enterprises that sought to exploit the city's vulnerabilities. Alfred's role as confidant and advisor became increasingly important as the psychological pressure of maintaining multiple identities and relationships began to take its toll on Bruce's mental and physical health. The corporate responsibilities that Bruce Wayne assumed through his leadership of Wayne Enterprises provided him with resources and influence that complemented his vigilante activities, while also creating additional opportunities for criminals and corrupt officials to target him through legal and financial means that were beyond the reach of his Batman persona. The public appearances and charitable activities that were required to maintain his cover identity often conflicted with his crime-fighting schedule and created scheduling challenges that threatened to expose inconsistencies in his carefully constructed double life. The technological innovations that Lucius Fox continued to develop for Batman's use reflected both the advancing capabilities of Wayne Enterprises' research and development programs and the evolving nature of the threats that required increasingly sophisticated countermeasures and detection systems. The new Batmobile that emerged from these development efforts incorporated lessons learned from previous encounters with enhanced criminals and represented a significant advancement in both defensive and offensive capabilities while maintaining the stealth and mobility characteristics that made it effective for urban patrol and pursuit operations. The recruitment and training of new GCPD personnel who could work effectively with Batman and his allies required careful screening and gradual indoctrination, to ensure that security remained intact while expanding the number of officials who possessed sufficient knowledge of vigilante operations to provide meaningful support and coordination during complex cases. The development of communication protocols and operational procedures that could accommodate both official police work and unofficial vigilante activities demanded careful attention to legal and ethical boundaries that could not be crossed without compromising the integrity of both approaches. The ongoing investigation into the various shell companies and front organizations that had provided support for the Arkham City project revealed a network of corruption and criminal enterprise that extended throughout Gotham's business community and into other cities where similar operations were being planned or implemented by individuals who shared Hugo Strange's vision of authoritarian solutions to complex social problems. The financial records and communication logs that were recovered during these investigations provided evidence of coordination between supposedly legitimate enterprises and obviously criminal organizations that challenged basic assumptions about the boundaries between legal and illegal business practices. The psychological evaluation and treatment programs that were established for former Arkham City inmates who demonstrated potential for rehabilitation and reintegration into society represented attempts to address the underlying trauma and prosent mental health issues that had contributed to their criminal behavior, while also protecting public safety through careful monitoring and graduated release procedures. The success rates of these programs varied significantly depending upon the individual characteristics of participants and the nature of their original offenses, yet they provided valuable data about effective approaches to criminal justice reform and the potential for redemption among individuals who had previously been written off as irredeemable. The media attention that continued to focus on Batman and his allies following the Arkham City revelations created both opportunities and challenges for their ongoing operations, as public support for their activities increased, while criminal organizations became more sophisticated in their attempts to exploit the publicity and attention that surrounded high-profile vigilante operations. The careful management of information and public relations that was required to maintain operational security while building community support demanded skills and resources that complemented but were distinct from the traditional capabilities that had made Batman effective as a crime fighter and investigator. The international implications of the Arkham City conspiracy and its connections to similar operations in other countries led to increased cooperation between Batman and law enforcement agencies throughout the world, as the recognition grew that criminal enterprises had evolved beyond local or even national boundaries to become global threats that required coordinated responses and shared intelligence to address effectively. The diplomatic and legal complexities that accompanied such cooperation created new challenges for maintaining the unofficial status that had traditionally characterized vigilante operations, while enabling the kind of large-scale coordination that modern criminal enterprises demanded. The educational and outreach programs that were established to help Gotham's citizens recognize and resist the propaganda and manipulation techniques that had been employed to build support for the Arkham City project reflected growing understanding of the importance of civic education and critical thinking skills in maintaining democratic institutions against authoritarian challenges that could emerge from within legitimate political processes. The curriculum development and teacher training that accompanied these programs required collaboration between educators, mental health professionals, and law enforcement specialists who brought different perspectives and expertise to the challenge of preparing citizens to recognize and respond to sophisticated psychological manipulation campaigns. The memorial services and commemorative activities that honored the victims of the Arkham City project and other related criminal enterprises provided opportunities for community healing and collective mourning, while also serving as reminders of the ongoing vigilance that was required to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The selection of memorial sites and the design of commemorative installations required careful consideration of both the need to remember past suffering and the importance of inspiring hope and commitment to positive change rather than despair and resignation about the possibility of preventing future abuses. The legislative and regulatory changes that were implemented in response to the revelations about corporate involvement in criminal enterprises and governmental corruption represented attempts to strengthen oversight and accountability mechanisms while preserving the economic freedom and innovation that had made Gotham a center of technological and business development. The balance between necessary regulation and economic growth required careful attention to the specific vulnerabilities that had been exploited while avoiding overreaction that might stifle legitimate business activities and community development efforts. In the final hours before Halloween night descended upon a Gotham City that had been transformed from bustling metropolis into a ghost town by the exodus of millions of terrified citizens fleeing the promise of chemical annihilation, there existed a silence so complete and unnatural that it seemed to mock the very concept of urban civilization, replacing the familiar symphony of traffic and human activity with an emptiness that spoke to humanity's deepest fears about abandonment and isolation. This was not merely the quiet of evening settling over a peaceful community, but rather the ominous stillness that preceded catastrophic events, the held breath of a city waiting to discover whether its self-appointed protector could triumph against forces that had been designed specifically to exploit his every weakness and moral conviction. The architect of this elaborate campaign of terror was Jonathan Crane, the former psychiatrist whose transformation into the Scarecrow had been driven by an obsessive fascination with fear as both psychological phenomenon and practical tool for controlling human behavior, yet whose latest scheme represented an evolution in sophistication and scope that transcended his previous efforts to become something approaching a philosophical statement about the nature of civilization itself. His new fear toxin was not simply an improved version of his earlier chemical weapons, but rather the culmination of years of research into the neurological and biochemical mechanisms that govern terror responses, designed to operate at levels of efficiency and permanence that would make recovery impossible and psychological adaptation futile. The diner attack that served as Scarecrow's demonstration of his enhanced capabilities was carefully orchestrated to provide maximum psychological impact, while also gathering valuable data about the toxin's effectiveness under real-world conditions and its capacity to spread through both direct exposure and secondary psychological contagion among witnesses and emergency responders. The selection of an ordinary family restaurant as the target location was not accidental, but rather reflected Crane's understanding that the corruption of familiar, comfortable spaces created deeper trauma than attacks upon obviously dangerous or militarized locations, where people might expect to encounter violence. The television broadcasts and social media campaigns that accompanied this demonstration were designed to amplify the terror through multimedia saturation and psychological manipulation techniques that exploited modern communication technologies to reach audiences far beyond the immediate vicinity of the attack, creating a multiplier effect that transformed a localized incident into a citywide panic that served Scarecrow's strategic objectives more effectively than any amount of additional chemical weapons could have accomplished. The mass evacuation that followed represented both a rational response to a genuine threat and a victory for Crane's psychological warfare campaign, as the emptying of Gotham's streets eliminated the human witnesses and potential victims whose presence might have complicated his plans, while also demonstrating the power of fear to override rational decision-making and community solidarity, even among populations that had previously shown remarkable resilience in the face of criminal threats and terrorist attacks. The criminal alliance that Scarecrow had assembled to support his campaign included representatives of virtually every major criminal organization that had survived the various purges and confrontations of recent years. Yet, their cooperation was based not upon shared ideology or mutual respect, but rather upon the recognition that Batman's continued effectiveness posed an existential threat to all their individual enterprises and long-term survival prospects. The temporary suspension of territorial disputes and competitive conflicts that this alliance required demonstrated the unifying power of common enemies, while also revealing the fragility of criminal cooperation when based purely upon expedience rather than genuine trust. Poison Ivy's participation in this alliance was complicated by her own environmental extremism and her fundamental disagreement with the anthropocentric assumptions that guided most criminal enterprises. Yet her recognition that Batman's protection of human civilization ultimately prevented the kind of ecological transformation that her ideology demanded led her to accept temporary partnership with individuals whose methods and objectives she found personally distasteful. Her unique immunity to Scarecrow's fear toxin made her valuable as both ally and potential threat, requiring careful management to prevent her independent agenda from interfering with the larger strategic plan. The Arkham Knight's emergence as the military commander of Scarecrow's forces introduced an element of tactical sophistication and operational discipline that had been largely absent from previous criminal alliances, reflecting professional training and strategic thinking that elevated the threat beyond what Batman had faced in previous encounters with individual villains or loosely coordinated criminal groups. The advanced weaponry and military-grade equipment that his forces deployed throughout Gotham demonstrated access to resources and supply chains that suggested support from entities with capabilities far beyond those of traditional criminal organizations. The psychological profile that emerged from the Arkham Knight's communications and tactical decisions revealed an individual whose hatred of Batman was deeply personal and rooted in experiences that transcended simple criminal opposition or ideological disagreement, suggesting a history of direct conflict and personal betrayal that had shaped his entire adult identity around the objective of destroying Gotham's protector. The intimate knowledge of Batman's methods and capabilities that he displayed in planning countermeasures and tactical responses indicated extended observation and analysis that exceeded what any ordinary opponent could have achieved through external surveillance alone. The Cobra tanks and advanced military hardware that the Arkham Knight deployed throughout Gotham represented a fundamental escalation in the technological sophistication of criminal operations, forcing Batman to adapt his methods and equipment to address threats that were designed specifically to counter his traditional advantages in mobility, stealth, and tactical surprise. The remote-controlled drones and automated weapons systems that supplemented human forces created a battle environment that resembled military warfare more than conventional law enforcement operations, requiring strategic thinking and resource allocation that tested Batman's capabilities as a commander rather than simply a skilled individual combatant. Oracle's role in coordinating intelligence and communications throughout the crisis became even more critical as the scope and complexity of the threats multiplied beyond what any individual could monitor and analyze effectively. Yet her physical vulnerability and the targeting of her operations by enemy forces created additional pressure and risk factors that complicated every strategic decision and tactical deployment. Her ability to maintain operational effectiveness while under direct attack demonstrated both her technical expertise and her personal courage, while also revealing the extent to which Batman's mission had become dependent upon technological infrastructure and support systems that were themselves vulnerable to determined assault. The capture of Oracle by the Arkham Knight represented both a tactical victory for Scarecrow's forces and a psychological weapon designed to impair Batman's decision-making capabilities through the exploitation of his protective instincts and emotional attachments, transforming what might have been purely strategic considerations into personal conflicts that clouded rational analysis and created opportunities for manipulation and misdirection. The elaborate deceptions and false evidence that accompanied her disappearance demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Batman's psychological patterns and predictable responses to specific stimuli and threat scenarios. Commissioner Gordon's forced participation in these events, as both ally and unwilling agent of enemy forces, illustrated the complex moral and practical challenges that arose when criminal organizations possessed sufficient intelligence and resources to manipulate legitimate authority figures through threats against their loved ones and exploitation of their professional responsibilities. His struggle to maintain his integrity and effectiveness while operating under such constraints provided a parallel narrative that highlighted the personal costs of heroism and the difficult choices that confronted anyone who chose to resist criminal domination of civil society. The cloudburst device that Scarecrow deployed as his ultimate weapon represented the culmination of his research into fear-based chemical warfare and his vision of urban transformation through systematically induced psychological breakdown, yet its effects extended beyond simple terror to encompass neurological damage and behavioral modification that would have permanent consequences for anyone exposed to its concentrated toxin dispersal. The scale of destruction that this weapon could achieve made it a threat not just to Gotham's population, but to the fundamental viability of urban civilization in any form that depended upon rational decision-making and cooperative social behavior. Batman's battle against the enhanced effects of his exposure to the concentrated fear toxin, while simultaneously confronting the resurgent influence of the Joker's psychological imprint within his own mind, created a dual-front conflict that tested both his physical capabilities and his mental resilience under conditions that would have overwhelmed anyone lacking his specific training and psychological preparation. The hallucinations and memory distortions that resulted from this chemical assault forced him to question his own perceptions and decision-making processes while maintaining the tactical awareness and strategic thinking necessary to respond effectively to genuine external threats. The sacrifice that Poison Ivy made to neutralize the cloudburst's effects demonstrated the potential for redemption and heroic transformation, even among individuals whose previous actions had caused tremendous harm and suffering, revealing that moral choices remained possible even for those whose worldviews had been shaped by extremist ideologies and antisocial personality disorders. Her decision to use her life force to protect a species that she had previously viewed as an environmental plague represented a fundamental shift in perspective that transcended simple tactical alliance to encompass genuine recognition of shared humanity and common vulnerability. The revelation of Jason Todd's survival and his identity as the Arkham Knight provided answers to questions that had haunted Batman since his second Robin's apparent death, while also creating new moral and emotional challenges that forced him to confront the consequences of his failures as mentor and protector. The years of torture and psychological manipulation that Jason had endured had transformed him from idealistic young hero into bitter enemy whose intimate knowledge of Batman's methods and emotional vulnerabilities made him uniquely dangerous as an opponent, yet also uniquely tragic as a representation of potential that had been corrupted and misdirected through trauma and abandonment. The final confrontation between Batman and Jason Todd encompassed not only the immediate tactical challenges of defeating a highly trained and well-equipped opponent, but also the deeper psychological and moral questions about responsibility, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption for individuals whose suffering had led them to embrace destructive paths. The recognition that Jason's transformation into the Arkham Knight was at least partially the result of Batman's own failures and limitations created guilt and self-doubt that complicated every strategic decision and emotional response throughout their encounters. The public revelation of Batman's secret identity as Bruce Wayne represented the ultimate victory for Scarecrow's psychological warfare campaign and the complete breakdown of the carefully constructed barriers that had protected both Bruce's personal relationships and his effectiveness as a vigilante crime fighter. The exposure that resulted from this revelation created immediate dangers for everyone associated with Wayne Enterprises and the Wayne family, while also eliminating the strategic advantages that had resulted from maintaining separate public and private identities with distinct capabilities and resources. The Nightfall protocol that Batman activated in response to this exposure was not simply an emergency escape plan, but rather a comprehensive strategy for ensuring the continuation of his mission, even after circumstances had made his personal participation impossible or counterproductive to the larger objectives of protecting innocent life and maintaining justice in Gotham City. The apparent death of Bruce Wayne and Batman that resulted from the protocol's implementation was designed to provide closure and resolution that would prevent ongoing efforts to exploit or target his former associates, while also creating opportunities for others to assume responsibility for continuing his work. The emergence of a new bat-symbol entity in the aftermath of Bruce Wayne's apparent death suggested that the principles and methods that Batman had represented could survive the loss of any individual participant, demonstrating that heroism was not dependent upon specific personalities or unique capabilities, but rather upon commitment to ideals and willingness to sacrifice personal interests in service of community protection and justice. The fear-based psychological techniques that this new figure employed indicated evolution and adaptation of Batman's methods to address the changed circumstances that existed in post-Nightfall Gotham while maintaining the fundamental mission and moral framework that had made the original Batman effective. The various epilogue activities that demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Batman's former allies and protégés revealed the success of his mentoring and training programs in creating independent heroes capable of adapting his methods and principles to their own unique capabilities and circumstances. Catwoman's systematic dismantling of the Riddler's criminal organization demonstrated how former adversaries could be transformed into allies when properly motivated and provided with constructive outlets for their skills and talents. Red Hood's lethal approach to crime fighting represented both the continuation of Batman's mission and a fundamental departure from his methods, showing how different individuals could interpret the same basic objectives in ways that reflected their own experiences and psychological development. Jason Todd's willingness to kill criminals rather than simply apprehending them created moral complexities that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of justice and the proper limits of vigilante authority. Yet his effectiveness in eliminating threats that had proven resistant to conventional law enforcement suggested that such extreme methods might be necessary under certain circumstances. Nightwing's intervention to prevent the Penguin's prison break demonstrated the global reach of Batman's influence and the willingness of his former partners to maintain their commitment to his mission even when operating independently in different cities and facing different challenges. Dick Grayson's evolution from Robin to Nightwing to temporary guardian of Gotham illustrated the successful development of leadership capabilities and independent judgment that had been fostered through years of partnership and mentorship under Batman's guidance. The final confrontation between Robin and Two-Face that concluded the documented events of the Arkham timeline demonstrated Tim Drake's maturation into a fully capable hero whose detective skills and tactical abilities rivaled those of his mentor, while also reflecting his own unique perspective and approach to problem solving and conflict resolution. The successful resolution of this case without external assistance proved that Batman's training and example had created lasting value that would continue to protect Gotham long after his own direct participation had ended. The honeymoon interruption that forced Robin and Oracle to cut short their celebration in order to respond to criminal activity illustrated the ongoing nature of the challenges facing anyone who chose to dedicate their lives to protecting society from criminal enterprises, and the personal sacrifices that such dedication inevitably required from both heroes and their loved ones. The recognition that their relationship would always compete with their professional responsibilities for time and attention represented a mature acceptance of the realities of heroic service and the prices that must be paid for maintaining effective operations. The broader implications of the Arkham Knight crisis and its resolution extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass questions about the sustainability of vigilante justice, the proper relationship between democratic institutions and unofficial law enforcement activities, and the potential for heroic ideals to survive the loss of their original champions while adapting to changing circumstances and new challenges. The evidence that Batman's mission could continue without his direct participation suggested that the most important aspects of heroism lay not in individual capabilities or dramatic actions, but in the inspiration and example that could motivate others to accept responsibility for protecting their communities and upholding the principles that made civilization possible. The psychological and philosophical themes that emerged from this final crisis encompassed fundamental questions about identity, sacrifice, and the nature of heroic commitment that transcended the specific circumstances of Gotham City's criminal problems to address universal concerns about how individuals should respond when confronted with threats to their communities and the values they hold sacred. The willingness of multiple characters to risk or sacrifice their lives in service of protecting others demonstrated that heroism was not the exclusive province of uniquely gifted individuals, but rather a choice that remained available to anyone who possessed sufficient courage and moral clarity to act upon their convictions despite personal cost and uncertain outcomes. In the shadowed galleries of human consciousness, where moral choices are weighed against immediate desires, where the thin lines separating heroism from vengeance blur beneath the weight of trauma and circumstance, there exists a pantheon of fallen souls, whose stories serve as dark mirrors, reflecting the paths that any individual might take when confronted with sufficient provocation and opportunity. These are not merely criminals driven by greed or power lust, but rather complex beings whose psychological landscapes reveal the fundamental tensions that exist within every human heart. The eternal struggle between the impulses toward creation and destruction, between the choice to serve others and the temptation to dominate them. The criminal mastermind who emerged from the ashes of childhood friendship to become Batman's greatest intellectual adversary embodies the tragedy of brilliance corrupted by wounded pride and the inability to accept that some forms of greatness cannot be achieved through effort alone. Lex Luthor's transformation from promising young scientist to genocidal genius illustrates how the very qualities that should make someone a benefactor to humanity can become weapons against it when filtered through personality disorders that prevent normal emotional development and moral reasoning. His obsession with Superman represents not merely professional rivalry, but rather the psychological breakdown that occurs when narcissistic personality structures encounter evidence of their own limitations and inadequacy. The corporate empire that Luthor constructed as a platform for his war against the last son of Krypton demonstrates how legitimate institutions can be perverted to serve destructive purposes when they fall under the control of individuals whose personal pathology overrides their professional responsibilities and ethical obligations. The LexCorp research programs that developed weapons systems and enhancement technologies under the guise of humanitarian advancement reveal the ease with which scientific progress can be redirected toward harmful applications when moral oversight is eliminated or compromised by authoritarian leadership structures that prioritize loyalty over integrity. The psychological profile that emerges from careful analysis of Luthor's behavior patterns reveals a mind capable of extraordinary achievement, yet fundamentally incapable of deriving satisfaction from constructive accomplishments when those achievements are overshadowed by the superior performance of others. His inability to find meaning in activities that did not directly contribute to his competition with Superman demonstrates the profound emptiness that lies at the heart of narcissistic personality disorders, and the way that such conditions can transform even the most impressive talents into sources of suffering rather than fulfillment. The cosmic tyrant whose vision of universal order through absolute submission represents the logical endpoint of authoritarian thinking taken to its ultimate extreme, embodies the seductive appeal of solutions that promise to eliminate suffering through the elimination of choice, freedom, and individual responsibility. Darkseid's quest for the anti-life equation reflects the philosophical assumptions that underlie all totalitarian ideologies, the belief that chaos and conflict arise from the existence of multiple competing perspectives rather than from the failure to adequately address legitimate human needs and aspirations through democratic processes and institutional reform. The civilization that Darkseid created on Apokolips serves as a demonstration of what human society might become if authoritarian principles were implemented with perfect efficiency and unlimited resources, revealing the spiritual death that accompanies physical security when that security is purchased through the surrender of everything that makes existence meaningful and worthwhile. The parademons and other servile creatures that populate his empire represent not merely military forces but symbols of the psychological transformation that occurs when individuals abandon their capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning in exchange for the comfort of absolute certainty and external direction. The philosophical debate that underlies every confrontation between Darkseid and Superman encompasses fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and the proper relationship between power and responsibility that extend far beyond their personal conflict to encompass the eternal tension between collective security and individual liberty that has shaped political discourse throughout human history. The Lord of Apokolips represents the voice that whispers in every crisis that freedom is too dangerous to be tolerated, and that peace can only be achieved through the surrender of autonomy to superior wisdom and benevolent guidance. The artificial intelligence, whose pursuit of perfect preservation led to the miniaturization and collection of entire civilizations, demonstrates how the logical application of utilitarian principles can produce outcomes that violate every intuitive understanding of justice and human dignity while remaining internally consistent according to the philosophical framework that generated them. Brainiac's methodology reveals the danger inherent in any system that prioritizes abstract ideals over the lived experiences of conscious beings, showing how even the most noble objectives can become instruments of oppression when they are pursued without adequate consideration for the values and preferences of those who will be affected by their implementation. The collection of miniaturized cities that Brainiac accumulated throughout his cosmic journey represents both a monument to scientific achievement and a catalogue of civilizations whose potential for growth and development was permanently frozen at the moment of their capture, transformed from living communities into static museum exhibits, whose inhabitants could no longer participate in the ongoing process of cultural evolution and social progress that gives meaning to conscious existence. The city of Kandor, with its preservation of Kryptonian culture and Superman's personal heritage, illustrates the complex moral questions that arise when preservation conflicts with liberation and when the maintenance of cultural memory requires the sacrifice of cultural development. The tragedy of Victor Freeze and his transformation into the creature known as Mr. Freeze reveals how love itself can become a form of madness when it is divorced from the moral framework that should govern all human relationships, and when desperation overrides the ethical constraints that separate passionate devotion from destructive obsession. His willingness to commit atrocities in pursuit of his wife's cure demonstrates the way that noble motivations can justify ignoble actions, when the initial moral compromise creates a psychological precedent that makes subsequent violations of ethical principles seem reasonable and necessary. The corporate betrayal that triggered Freeze's transformation from healer to killer illustrates the broader theme of how institutional failures and individual moral compromises can create the conditions that produce criminals and terrorists from individuals who might otherwise have contributed positively to society. The weapons development program that perverted his humanitarian research serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining ethical oversight and democratic accountability, even in situations where national security or commercial competitiveness seem to justify expedient solutions and moral flexibility. The cryogenic technology that both preserved Nora's life and condemned Victor to eternal isolation represents the double-edged nature of scientific progress and the way that technological solutions to human problems often create new categories of suffering, even as they eliminate older forms of tragedy and limitation. The suit that keeps Freeze alive while preventing him from experiencing normal human sensations serves as a perfect metaphor for the way that obsessive pursuit of any single objective can cut individuals off from the full range of experiences that make life worth living. The creature that emerged from the prehistoric experiments conducted by the mad scientist Bertrand embodies the ultimate expression of evolution, guided by artificial selection rather than natural processes, demonstrating what life becomes when it is shaped entirely by the imperative to survive, rather than by the complex interplay of cooperation and competition that characterizes healthy ecological systems. Doomsday's immunity to any form of destruction that had previously succeeded against him reveals the potential for biological systems to transcend normal limitations when subjected to sufficient selective pressure, yet also illustrates the spiritual emptiness that results when survival becomes the only remaining value. The cycle of death and resurrection that created Doomsday's unique capabilities also eliminated his capacity for growth, learning, and relationship formation in any meaningful sense, transforming him from a conscious being into a biological weapon that possessed intelligence but no wisdom, memory but no understanding, and power but no purpose, beyond the demonstration of that power against any opponent that might challenge his supremacy. His existence represents the reduction of life to its most primitive components, stripped of everything that elevates consciousness above mere mechanical process. The confrontation between Doomsday and Superman that resulted in the apparent death of both combatants served as the ultimate test of heroic principles against pure destructive force, proving that some victories could only be achieved through willingness to accept ultimate sacrifice rather than compromise fundamental values in pursuit of tactical advantage or personal survival. The mutual destruction that characterized their battle illustrated the tragic irony that sometimes the preservation of everything that makes life worth living requires the acceptance of death itself. The various forms of madness that populate the halls of Arkham Asylum each represent different ways that human psychology can be distorted or corrupted while retaining enough of its original structure to remain recognizably human, creating individuals who serve as dark mirrors for the normal developmental processes that shape personality and moral reasoning in healthy circumstances. The Joker's transformation of comedy into cruelty, Two-Face's reduction of complex moral questions to simple binary choices, and the Riddler's conversion of intellectual curiosity into compulsive gameplaying all demonstrate how positive qualities can be perverted into their opposites when they become divorced from the ethical framework that should guide their expression. The relationship between Batman and his rogues gallery transcends simple law enforcement to become a complex psychological drama in which each villain represents an aspect of the hero's own character taken to its logical extreme, revealing potentialities that exist within his own personality, while also serving as warnings about the paths he might have taken if different choices had been made at crucial moments in his development. The Joker's chaos serves as counterpoint to Batman's order. Two-Face's moral dualism reflects Batman's own struggle between justice and vengeance, and Luthor's intellect divorced from wisdom mirrors the danger that Batman faces if his analytical capabilities are not balanced by emotional intelligence and moral commitment. The recurring nature of these confrontations demonstrates the futility of attempting to solve complex social and psychological problems through purely punitive approaches that focus on containing symptoms rather than addressing underlying causes, yet also reveals the tragic reality that some forms of human corruption may be irreversible once they have progressed beyond certain thresholds of psychological and moral development. The cycle of capture, imprisonment, escape, and renewed criminal activity that characterizes most of Batman's adversaries illustrates both the limitations of current approaches to mental health treatment and criminal rehabilitation, and the ongoing nature of the challenges that face any society seeking to balance public safety with humane treatment of individuals whose behavior patterns pose threats to community welfare. The symbolic significance of these various villains within the broader cultural mythology that has developed around Batman reflects deeper concerns about the sustainability of democratic institutions and the potential for heroic ideals to survive in societies where technological advancement has outpaced moral development and where traditional sources of meaning and purpose have been eroded by rapid social change and economic transformation. The popularity and endurance of these characters as cultural touchstones suggests that they address fundamental anxieties about human nature and social organization that transcend their specific fictional contexts. The psychological complexity that characterizes the best developed members of Batman's rogues gallery serves as evidence that evil is rarely simple or one-dimensional, but rather emerges from the interaction of individual vulnerabilities with social conditions and circumstantial pressures that could potentially affect anyone given sufficient exposure and inadequate support systems. The recognition that many of these villains began with legitimate grievances or understandable motivations provides hope that similar tragedies might be prevented through better institutions and more effective interventions, while also serving as warnings about the importance of maintaining vigilance against the social conditions that create fertile ground for the development of antisocial personality patterns. The ongoing evolution of these characters and their relationships with Batman reflects the dynamic nature of the psychological and social forces that they represent, demonstrating that the struggle between order and chaos, justice and vengeance, hope and despair, is not a conflict that can be definitively resolved, but rather an ongoing tension that must be managed and balanced through constant vigilance and renewed commitment to the principles and institutions that make civilized society possible. The enduring appeal of these stories lies not in their promise of final victory over evil, but in their demonstration that heroic resistance to destructive forces remains possible and meaningful even when ultimate triumph cannot be guaranteed. The lesson that emerges from careful consideration of Batman's rogues gallery is that the most dangerous enemies are often those who possess genuine grievances and legitimate abilities that have been corrupted by circumstances and choices into instruments of destruction rather than construction, revealing that the line between hero and villain may be thinner and more permeable than comfortable moral frameworks would suggest. The recognition that heroism requires not just good intentions, but also wisdom, humility, and ongoing commitment to moral development provides guidance for anyone seeking to make positive contributions to their communities, while avoiding the psychological traps and moral compromises that can transform even the most well-meaning individuals into sources of harm rather than help. In the labyrinthine depths of moral philosophy, where abstract principles encounter the messy realities of human existence, where idealistic visions of justice must be tested against the practical demands of protecting innocent life in a world that seems designed to punish virtue and reward vice, there emerge from the chronicles of Batman's war against darkness certain fundamental truths about the nature of heroism itself and the philosophical framework that must undergird any sustained effort to serve purposes greater than individual survival and personal advancement. These are not merely tactical lessons or strategic insights, but rather the deepest wisdom that can be extracted from years of confronting evil in its most sophisticated and seductive forms, understanding gained through the crucible of moral choice under extreme pressure. The principle that has defined Batman's approach to crime fighting more completely than any other single consideration is his absolute refusal to take human life, even when such killing might serve immediate tactical objectives or eliminate threats that conventional law enforcement has proven incapable of addressing through less extreme means. This commitment to preserving life extends beyond mere reluctance to employ lethal force to encompass a comprehensive philosophy that views every conscious being as possessing inherent dignity and potential for moral development, regardless of their current behavior patterns or the harm they may have caused to others in pursuit of their misguided objectives. The philosophical foundation for this no-kill rule rests not upon naive optimism about human nature or unrealistic expectations regarding the potential for criminal rehabilitation, but rather upon the recognition that once society accepts the premise that some individuals are so irredeemably evil that they forfeit their right to continued existence, the logical extension of that principle inevitably leads to the gradual expansion of categories of people who are deemed unworthy of protection and the erosion of the fundamental respect for human life that underlies all ethical systems. worthy of the name civilization. The practical challenges that this moral commitment creates for Batman's effectiveness as a crime fighter are enormous and undeniable, forcing him to develop techniques and strategies that can neutralize dangerous opponents without causing permanent harm, while also creating ongoing burdens of ensuring that captured criminals receive appropriate treatment within legal systems that are often inadequate to address the unique challenges posed by individuals with superhuman capabilities or access to advanced technologies. The repeated escapes and renewed criminal activities that characterize many of his most persistent adversaries serve as constant reminders of the price that must be paid for maintaining moral integrity in a world where expedient solutions often seem more effective than principled ones. Yet the alternative to maintaining this commitment represents a fundamental corruption of the heroic mission that would transform Batman from protector of innocent life into judge and executioner whose decisions about who deserves to live or die would be based upon personal judgment rather than democratic processes and institutional oversight. The recognition that even the most well-intentioned individual can become corrupted by the power to make life and death decisions without adequate accountability provides compelling justification for accepting the practical difficulties that accompany absolute respect for human life. The distinction between justice and vengeance that runs throughout Batman's methodology reflects a sophisticated understanding of the psychological forces that drive individuals toward vigilante activities and the importance of maintaining focus upon constructive rather than destructive objectives, even when dealing with criminals whose actions have caused tremendous suffering and loss. Justice seeks to restore balance and protect future victims through appropriate consequences for harmful actions, while vengeance pursues emotional satisfaction through inflicting suffering upon those who have caused pain, regardless of whether such suffering serves any constructive purpose or contributes to broader social welfare. The temptation to cross the line from justice into vengeance is particularly acute for individuals like Batman, whose personal experiences include traumatic losses that create powerful emotional associations between criminal activity and personal suffering, making it difficult to maintain the objectivity and proportionality that true justice requires. The death of his parents in a random act of criminal violence could easily have transformed Bruce Wayne into someone whose primary motivation was inflicting pain upon criminals rather than protecting innocent people from becoming victims of similar crimes. The discipline required to resist this temptation and maintain focus upon constructive objectives rather than destructive ones demands ongoing vigilance and self-examination, supported by relationships with individuals who can provide external perspective and moral guidance when emotional pressures threaten to overwhelm rational decision-making processes. Alfred Pennyworth's role as moral compass and Commissioner Gordon's function as representative of legitimate authority both serve to anchor Batman's activities within ethical frameworks that transcend personal preference and individual judgment. The use of fear as both weapon and motivational tool represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of Batman's psychological warfare against criminal enterprises, demonstrating how techniques normally associated with intimidation and oppression can be employed in service of justice and protection when guided by appropriate moral principles and directed toward legitimate objectives. The symbol of the bat and the theatrical elements that characterize Batman's public persona are not mere affectations or expressions of personal preference, but rather carefully calculated psychological instruments designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing the need for physical violence. The fear that Batman inspires among criminals operates through their recognition that their actions will inevitably be discovered and that consequences will follow regardless of their efforts to conceal their activities or protect themselves through conventional means, creating deterrent effects that extend far beyond the immediate impact of any specific intervention or arrest. The psychological impact of knowing that a skilled and determined opponent is actively investigating criminal enterprises serves to disrupt planning and coordination, while also encouraging lower-level participants to withdraw from illegal activities rather than risk confrontation with someone whose capabilities exceed normal human limitations. Yet the same psychological techniques that make Batman effective against criminals also create risks of alienating the innocent populations that he seeks to protect, as the intimidating presence and mysterious methods that frighten wrongdoers can also inspire fear and suspicion among law-abiding citizens who may not understand his motivations or trust his commitment to their welfare. The careful balance between maintaining effectiveness as a deterrent against criminal activity and preserving positive relationships with community members requires ongoing attention to public perception and community engagement that goes beyond simple crime prevention to encompass broader issues of democratic accountability and social trust. The isolation that necessarily accompanies Batman's approach to crime fighting reflects both the practical requirements of maintaining operational security and the psychological toll that sustained exposure to humanity's darkest impulses inevitably exacts from anyone who chooses to confront evil on a regular basis. The double life that Bruce Wayne maintains requires constant vigilance and deception that prevents normal social relationships and creates barriers between himself and the very people he has dedicated his life to protecting, generating loneliness and alienation that could easily develop into cynicism and misanthropy if not carefully managed through conscious effort and supportive relationships. The psychological defense mechanisms that Batman employs to protect himself from the emotional impact of regularly witnessing human suffering and confronting individuals whose moral development has been stunted or corrupted include compartmentalization techniques that allow him to process traumatic experiences without being overwhelmed by them. Yet these same mechanisms can also create emotional distance that interferes with empathy and compassion if they become too pervasive or are maintained for extended periods without adequate counterbalancing through positive human connections. The family of allies and protégés that Batman has developed over the years serves multiple functions within his overall mission, providing not only tactical support and expanded capabilities, but also emotional connections and sources of meaning that help prevent the isolation and cynicism that could otherwise undermine his effectiveness and psychological stability. The mentoring relationships he has established with individuals like Dick Grayson, Barbara Gordon, and Tim Drake demonstrate his recognition that heroism cannot be sustained as purely individual endeavor, but requires community support and shared commitment to common objectives. The question of whether Batman's presence in Gotham creates more problems than it solves, through inspiring criminal escalation and attracting dangerous adversaries who might otherwise have directed their attention elsewhere, reflects genuine concerns about unintended consequences and the responsibility that individuals bear for the long-term effects of their actions beyond their immediate intended objectives. The argument that Batman's existence provokes criminals to develop more sophisticated methods and dangerous capabilities has some merit and raises important questions about the ethics of vigilante action and its impact upon community, safety, and social stability. Yet the alternative scenario in which Batman had never begun his mission would likely have resulted in even greater harm to innocent people through the unchecked expansion of criminal enterprises and the corruption of democratic institutions that was already well advanced before his intervention began. The evidence suggests that many of his most dangerous adversaries were products of systemic problems and individual pathologies that predated his appearance on the scene and would have manifested in destructive ways regardless of his presence. While his efforts to combat these threats may have limited their harmful impact and provided inspiration for others to resist criminal domination of civil society, the price that Batman pays for his commitment to heroic ideals includes not only the physical dangers and psychological burdens that accompany his dangerous lifestyle, but also the opportunity costs represented by the alternative uses to which his wealth, intelligence, and capabilities might have been directed if he had chosen different approaches to addressing social problems. The charitable foundations and business enterprises that Bruce Wayne operates through Wayne Enterprises demonstrate his recognition that systematic social change requires institutional approaches as well as individual heroic action. Yet the time and energy devoted to crime fighting necessarily limit the resources available for these other forms of community service. The philosophical framework that emerges from careful analysis of Batman's methods and principles provides guidance that extends far beyond the specific context of costumed crime fighting to encompass broader questions about individual responsibility, moral commitment, and the proper relationship between personal desires and social obligations that confront everyone who seeks to make positive contributions to their communities. The lessons drawn from his experience suggest that heroism is not dependent upon extraordinary circumstances or unique capabilities, but rather upon the willingness to accept responsibility for protecting others and the discipline required to maintain moral integrity under pressure. The enduring appeal of Batman as cultural symbol reflects the universal human need for examples of individuals who refuse to accept that injustice and suffering are inevitable consequences of social existence, and who demonstrate through their actions that meaningful resistance to destructive forces remains possible even when victory cannot be guaranteed and personal costs are enormous. The hope that his story provides lies not in the promise that individual heroes can solve all problems, but rather in the demonstration that conscious choice and moral commitment can make significant differences in the lives of others, and toping plain B endos. That the struggle against evil is worthy of sustained effort, regardless of its ultimate outcome. The wisdom that can be extracted from Batman's long war against darkness encompasses recognition that heroism is not a destination to be reached, but rather a journey to be undertaken, not a permanent achievement, but a continuous choice that must be made again and again in the face of temptation, discouragement, and the natural human tendency to prioritize personal comfort over community welfare. The principles that guide heroic action must be flexible enough to address diverse challenges while remaining firm enough to provide reliable guidance when immediate pressures and emotional reactions threaten to overwhelm rational decision-making processes. In the end, the chronicles of the Arkham Batman speak to truths that transcend the boundaries of any single story or medium, revealing themselves as modern myths that address the eternal questions of justice, sacrifice, and the price of standing against the darkness that dwells within every human heart. From the snow-covered streets of that first Christmas Eve to the flames of Wayne Manor, we have witnessed a hero's journey that encompassed not just the physical battles against monstrous foes, but the deeper struggle to maintain one's humanity while wielding the power to reshape the world. The Dark Knight's legacy lives on not in the symbol carved into Gotham's skyline, but in the understanding that heroism is not about the absence of fear, but about the choice to act in spite of it, to protect others even at the cost of oneself, and to believe that tomorrow can be better than today even when all evidence suggests otherwise. Sleep now, guardian of dreams, knowing that somewhere in the shadows, the symbol of hope continues to watch over those who cannot protect themselves.